Cordelia Vane set her china cup down on the table so hard that the saucer cracked. Nobody at her dinner table moved. She reset the bone herself. Cordelia's voice came out low and clipped, the kind of voice she used when she was past the point of performing composure. That big, rough, sun-baked woman put her hands on that boy in my town, in front of my guests, and every man in that saloon just let her. Her husband Gerald opened his mouth. Don't. She held up one finger without looking at him. She stood slowly, smoothed her skirts, and walked to the window facing the dark street. Somewhere out there, Maren Danner, now, God help them all, was sleeping in the sheriff's house like she belonged there. Like she'd always belonged there. Cordelia's reflection looked back at her from the glass, pale and rigid. She had worked 15 years to make Red Hollow what it was. Every marriage, every appointment, every social arrangement that held this town together ran through her hands first. And Silas Danner had gone and fetched himself a bride off a railroad platform like she was a piece of mail-order furniture. And now half the town was looking at that woman like she'd hung the stars. Not in my town. If you are watching this story for the first time, please take a moment right now to subscribe to our channel and tap the like button so you never miss the stories we bring you. Drop a comment below and tell us the city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The train arrived 40 minutes late into Red Hollow, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the number of people who had gathered at the platform to watch it pull in, not because anyone was expecting cargo or family, but because Sheriff Silas Danner was standing there in his good coat, and everyone in a 3-block radius had figured out why. He was waiting for his bride. The gossip had started 6 weeks earlier when word got around that Silas had responded to a matrimonial advertisement in a Cheyenne paper. People had opinions about that. Most of those opinions belonged to Cordelia Vane, who had spent the better part of 4 years carefully positioning her niece Lenora as the natural and obvious solution to the sheriff's widowhood. She had hosted dinners, arranged seating, engineered conversations, and Silas had eaten the food and made pleasant talk, and then apparently gone home and written a letter to a woman he had never laid eyes on. Cordelia had not recovered from this information. She was present at the platform now, standing with 3 other women beneath the edge of the station overhang, her mouth arranged in a thin, watching line. Silas stood apart from all of them. He had his hat in his hands, which he almost never did, and he was turning the brim in slow circles without seeming to realize it. He was a tall man, lean in the way of men who spent too many hours in the saddle and not enough at a dinner table, with a jaw that had been broken once in a bar fight and had healed slightly crooked. He wasn't a handsome man in any decorative sense. He was the kind of man who looked exactly like what he was, somebody who had seen considerable trouble and hadn't run from any of it. His deputy, Roy Casper, stood a few feet to his left and had the good sense to say nothing. The train coughed into the station, trailing smoke and noise, and the platform filled with the usual confusion men unloading crates, a family with 4 noisy children pouring onto the platform, a traveling salesman tripping over his own sample case. Silas watched the passenger car door without blinking. Then she stepped down. He recognized her only because she was the last woman off the car who was traveling alone. She was not what Red Hollow had been picturing. Cordelia Vane made a sound. It was barely audible, a small compressed exhale of satisfaction, the sound a woman makes when she has been proven correct about something she suspected all along. Maren Whitlock was taller than most of the men watching her. She had broad shoulders and brown hands and sun-darkened skin that spoke of years outdoors without the shelter of parasols or parlors. She wore a gray traveling dress that had been pressed carefully but was visibly not new, and she carried a single battered trunk with a leather strap worn thin at the buckle. Her hair was dark brown, pinned practically rather than fashionably. Her face was neither soft nor severe. It was a face that had learned how to wait. She looked at the platform. She found Silas probably because he was staring at her, and she walked toward him, without hesitation, without fluttering, without any of the performance that the watching women were silently demanding of her. "Sheriff Danner," she said. Her voice was low and steady, the voice of someone accustomed to being heard the first time. She put out her hand. Silas shook it. He had been expecting to offer his arm. He hadn't expected a handshake. He recovered after a half-second delay that nobody who wasn't watching very closely would have noticed. Miss Whitlock, glad you made it. Train was late out of Laramie. Lost an hour. That happens, I know, I wasn't complaining. They stood there a moment, two strangers who had exchanged a handful of formal letters and were now expected to share a house and a name, taking a brief inventory of each other with the careful neutrality of people who knew better than to decide anything too fast. Roy Casper cleared his throat and stepped forward. Deputy Roy Casper. Ma'am, he tipped his hat. Roy. She nodded at him with the ease of someone who'd been meeting strangers her whole life. Silas reached for the trunk. She didn't protest, which he appreciated, though he noted she'd carried it off the train herself without waiting for help. We'll get the license sorted today at the courthouse, he said as they walked. Reverend Tillis is, he caught himself, Justice of the Peace, Harlan Meads. He's available this afternoon if that suits you. That suits me. It was not a romantic conversation. But then, neither of them had advertised romance. Silas had written plainly in his letter, I am a widower with a house, like a steady income, and no particular gift for social graces. I need a capable partner, not a performance. And she had written back, equally plainly, I am a frontier woman with practical skills and no patience for pretending otherwise. I can work. I can keep a house. I cannot promise to be what I am not. He had liked that letter considerably. Behind them, Cordelia Vane watched the pair walk away from the platform and felt the specific fury of a woman who sees her plan failing and cannot publicly acknowledge that she had a plan. Well, said Margaret Hollis, standing beside her. She's sturdy. She's unsuitable, Cordelia said. And before the month is out, Silas Danner is going to realize it. She said it quietly, with the confidence of a prediction rather than a wish. She was wrong about the month. She was wrong about most of it. But she wouldn't understand that yet. Courthouse marriage took 11 minutes. Harlan Meads read the words in the flat, procedural tone of a man who had read them 300 times before. Maren said, I do clearly. Silas said, I do a beat later. Roy Casper and the courthouse secretary witnessed. There were no flowers, no music, no gathering of well-wishers. Silas put a plain gold band on Maren's finger. It had been his mother's, and she looked at it for a moment, without speaking. It fits, she said finally. I guessed from the letters, he said. You described your hands. That surprised her slightly. So I did. They walked back to the house in the late afternoon light, Silas carrying the trunk and the silence between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but full the silence of two people who have many things to figure out and haven't started yet. The house was a two-story frame structure on the edge of town, set back from the road with a porch that needed new boards on the left side. Maren noted this without commenting. She noted other things too as Silas pushed the front door open, a coat rack with a woman's shawl still hanging on the third hook, curtains in the kitchen that had been chosen with care by someone else, quilt folded over the back of the parlor chair in a pattern too delicate for a man living alone to have selected. Silas's dead wife, Clara, dead 4 years, apparently still living in every room. Maren put her hand on the kitchen doorframe and looked at the cold stove. I'll start supper, she said. You don't have to tonight. I'd rather be busy. He looked at her. She was already moving toward the woodbox. The pantry's not much, he said. I haven't kept a proper house since. He stopped. I'll see what's there. He set the trunk at the foot of the stairs and stood in the kitchen doorway watching her open the pantry with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been making something from nothing for a long time. She found dried beans, a heel of salt pork, cornmeal, a jar of preserved tomatoes. She didn't look disappointed. She pulled things out and set them on the counter with the quiet focus of someone solving a problem. You cooked for your father, Silas said. He remembered it from one of her letters, and everyone else in whatever camp he was working. She filled the pot. Frontier doctors don't get to be particular about their hours or their help. How long did you travel with him? From the time I was 7 until he died 2 years ago. 20 years, more or less. That's a long time. She glanced at him over her shoulder. It was. I wouldn't take it back. He leaned against the doorframe. Where all did you go? Colorado mining camps, mostly, for the first stretch. Then Montana for a while. Sometime in the Idaho Territory. She stirred the pot without looking at it. Everywhere there were men getting injured in places too far from real medical help. Silas was quiet for a moment. What happened after he died? She didn't answer right away. She put the lid on the pot, checked the fire, wiped her hands on her apron. I spent a year trying to find a position, she said. I know frontier medicine better than most people who haven't been to medical school. I've set bones, I've stitched wounds. I've pulled bullets and treated infection and delivered 2 babies in circumstances that would make most physicians' hair stand up. She turned and faced him with the directness he was already beginning to recognize as simply her way. Nobody wanted to hire a woman for any of it. The best offer I had was laundry work in a boarding house. So you answered a matrimonial ad. I answered 6. Yours seemed the most honest. He almost smiled. I wasn't trying for flattery. Neither was I. She turned back to the stove. The kitchen was starting to smell like something. Outside the window, the sun was finishing its drop behind the western ridge, and the sky had gone that particular bruised orange-purple that only happens in Wyoming in October. I won't pretend this house is easy to walk into, Silas said after a while. Clara's been gone 4 years, but I haven't. He stopped again. He had a habit of stopping in the middle of sentences that required something of him. You haven't changed much, Maren said. Not an accusation. A fact. No, I'm not asking you to erase her. I know. But I'd like to take that shawl off the coat rack, she said. Not to be rid of her. Just it makes the house feel like I'm a guest. And I'm not a guest. He was quiet for a long moment. All right, he said. He took the shawl down himself, folded it carefully, and set it on the shelf in the upstairs hall, where Maren couldn't see whether he stood there with it for a minute before he came back down. But she suspected he did, and she let him have that. Cordelia moved on Red Hollow's social machinery, the way a woman moves chess pieces with patience and precision, and the absolute conviction that she would win eventually. Within 3 days of Maren's arrival, the murmuring had organized itself into a set of repeating themes. The sheriff's new wife was coarse. She worked outside without gloves. She talked to the ranch hands directly, without the appropriate buffer of feminine distance. She'd been seen at the livery asking questions about a lame horse. She didn't attend the women's temperance circle on Wednesday morning. Maren was aware of all of it. She said nothing. What she did instead was find the dead vegetable garden behind the house and begin clearing it. The season was too far gone for summer crops, but there were winter greens that could still go in, and the soil needed turning regardless. She worked through cold mornings with the methodical patience of someone who understood that gardens, like most things, responded better to work than to wanting. Hector Ruiz, who ran the small ranch adjacent to the Danner property and had 3 hired hands, stopped by the fence one afternoon and watched her for a while. You know what you're doing, he said finally. She looked up. With soil? Reasonably well. My father grew vegetables. He said it like a confession. I never learned. We've been buying from the Hollis farm all year. Turnips overwinter well, she said. So does kale, if you put it in before the first hard frost. I'm putting in both, he nodded slowly. He took off his hat and put it back on. My wife Dolores, she asked me to say hello. Say hello back. Hector Ruiz went home and told Dolores that the sheriff's wife was all right. Dolores told 2 other women. One of those women mentioned it to her husband, who mentioned it to Roy Casper, who said nothing to Silas but stood on the porch the next morning, drinking coffee and watching Maren drag a dead rosebush out of the side yard with her bare hands. She's something, Roy said. She's practical, Silas said, watching too. Lot of women practical that way would go to pieces in this town inside of a week. She hasn't. Nope. Roy drank his coffee. Cordelia Vane went by her yesterday while she was in the garden. Said something I couldn't hear. Your wife didn't even turn around. Silas turned his coffee cup in his hands. What did Cordelia do? Stood there a minute. Then she left. Roy paused. I don't think she's used to being ignored. Nobody ignores Cordelia Vane. Your wife does. Silas didn't say anything to that. But he looked at Maren through the window for a moment longer before he put on his hat and went to work. The change happened in increments so small that Silas didn't register any single one of them. It was only looking back, much later, that he could plot the line. The first week, he came home to a hot supper every night and ate it across from a woman he barely knew, making the cautious conversation of strangers who were also somehow already married. The second week, he started telling her things about his day without deciding to small things. Nothing important, The kind of talk you have with someone when you're tired and they're near. The third week, she asked him about Red Hollow's water situation, specifically about the creek that fed the Ruiz property and 3 others, and whether there had ever been disputes about access. He told her about the argument 2 years back that nearly turned into a shooting, and she listened with the focused attention of someone filing information away for reasons she wasn't sharing yet. Why? He asked. Hector mentioned the creek runs slower than it used to. He thinks someone upstream is diverting it. That's worth looking into. Thought so. She stood to clear the plates. You're the sheriff. Yes. He watched her for a moment. Where'd you hear that? From Hector directly. From his wife, who mentioned it to me while her youngest was crying, and she was trying to keep him from knocking over my soup pot. Silas paused. Dolores Ruiz came here? She brought bread. We made soup. Maren set the plates in the basin. She's lonely. And I needed the company. He hadn't known she was lonely. He hadn't asked. He filed that away, guilty in the way of a man who mistakes quiet competence for self-sufficiency. The 4th week, he poured her coffee before his own one morning without thinking. He only realized he'd done it when she looked at the cup he'd set in front of her, then at him, with an expression he couldn't completely decode, not warmth exactly, not gratitude. Something more complicated than either. Thank you, she said. Sure, he said, as if he'd meant to. He had not meant to, but he didn't correct the impression. Cordelia's dinner for the territorial magistrate was announced on a Thursday, invitations delivered by Friday morning. Maren received hers at the door from a boy of about 12, who handed her the envelope and then stared at her with the frank curiosity of a child who'd heard things and was assessing their accuracy. You're the sheriff's wife, he said. I am. People say you're real big. People say lots of things. She gave him a nickel. Thank you for the delivery. She read the invitation inside. It was beautifully produced. Cordelia's stationery was always beautiful, with the magistrate's name printed in the center, and the dinner details arranged around it with the kind of formal precision that announces its own importance. At the bottom, in smaller print, dress appropriate to the occasion. That last line had not appeared on anyone else's invitation. Maren had made a point of asking Dolores Ruiz. She showed the invitation to Silas that evening. He read the small print at the bottom, and something tightened around his jaw. You don't have to go, he said. She wants me to decline, Maren said. That's why she worded it that way. So if I don't go, she can tell everyone I knew I didn't belong there. And if I do go looking wrong, she can use that too. Silas looked at her. You've run into this before. Everywhere my father and I went. Camp women don't get invited to the mine owner's dinner, but if they don't come when they're finally asked, it proves something. She set the invitation on the table. I'll go. I'll be there. I know you will. She paused. Your presence doesn't fix it, Silas. She's not afraid of you. She's counting on the fact that you can't arrest someone for social cruelty. He looked at her for a long moment. No, I can't. So I'll go and I'll manage. She picked up the invitation again. She wants a performance. I won't give her one. He studied her. You're not nervous. She set the invitation down again. She was quiet for a moment, and he noticed for the first time that her jaw had gone slightly tight. I'm nervous, she said. I'm just not going to let it out where she can use it. He hadn't expected the honesty. It caught him off guard in a way that very little did anymore. I'll get you there and back, he said. Whatever happens in between, that's yours to handle. That's all I needed to hear. The night of the dinner, Maren wore her second-best dress, the dark blue one with the good collar that she'd been keeping back. She'd pressed it herself. She'd done her hair up properly. She looked, by any reasonable measure, presentable. She walked into Cordelia Vane's parlor beside Silas and felt every head in the room turn toward her and calculate. The territorial magistrate, a stout man named Gerald Putnam with side whiskers, and the satisfied air of someone who expected good food and got it, received them with the standard social warmth of a man who shook 30 hands a week. Silas introduced Maren. Putnam said something appropriate. Maren responded appropriately. It was fine. What was not fine was the table arrangement. Cordelia had seated Maren at the far end. Flanked by women who had already been briefed, Maren could tell from the small, practiced smiles the way their eyes went to each other. She was seated opposite Lenora, Cordelia's niece, who was 22 and fashionably dressed, and who looked at Maren with the wounded bewilderment of a woman who doesn't understand why someone else is sitting in the chair that was supposed to be hers. Maren understood. She didn't blame Lenora. Lenora hadn't done anything. The dinner proceeded. The food was extraordinary. Cordelia had imported a cook from Cheyenne for the occasion, and the courses came out in proper sequence with proper accompaniments. Maren ate. She spoke when spoken to. She did not volunteer opinions about things she hadn't been asked about. Cordelia waited. She had a talent for timing, and she knew that Maren's stillness was not ignorance. So she waited until the table was relaxed, until the magistrate was comfortable, until everyone had enough wine in them to enjoy a scene without feeling badly about it. Then she said, loudly enough to carry, "Mrs. Danner, I understand you're quite the cook yourself. Do tell, what sort of meals did you manage on the frontier? One imagines it was rather rustic." The table heard. It was designed to be heard. Maren looked at her. She set her fork down carefully. Mostly what was available, she said. Venison stew, salt pork, dried beans, whatever the hunting was like. How practical, Cordelia said, smiling at the women on either side of her. Nothing like tonight's supper, I imagine. No, Maren agreed. Tonight's supper is beautiful. Your cook from Cheyenne does excellent work. Cordelia's smile thinned. She had not expected Maren to know the cook was from Cheyenne. A woman at a frontier camp, Cordelia continued. Pressing. I wonder what other skills one develops. It must be quite different from a proper domestic education. Different, yes. Maren reached for her water glass. A proper domestic education teaches you to present food beautifully. She looked at the table, the arrangement, the careful china. Mine taught me to make sure no one went without. Both are useful, I suppose, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. The table went slightly quiet. Cordelia felt the ground shift and steadied herself. And what she didn't finish the sentence. The screaming started outside. It was young and ragged and came from the direction of the livery, a boy's voice cracking on the high notes in a way that meant genuine pain, not mischief. Two of the men at the table were already pushing their chairs back before anyone had spoken. Silas was on his feet. Then everyone was moving, the formal dinner disintegrating into the immediate and more urgent business of what was happening in the street. Maren was already at the door. She didn't stop to explain. She didn't wait for permission or propriety or anyone to tell her to come along. She was out Cordelia Vane's front door before the magistrate had fully stood, and she was already moving at a near run toward the sounds coming from behind the livery, and the night air was cold, and the screaming was getting worse. And somewhere ahead of her, a boy was in serious trouble. She ran toward it the way she always had. The same way she'd run toward every bad thing since she was 7 years old, holding a lamp for her father in the dark. The boy was 17 years old, and his name was Tobin Rusk, and he was lying in the dirt behind the livery with his right arm bent in a direction that arms do not bend. Maren saw it the moment she came around the corner of the building. She'd seen broken limbs before too many times, in too many places, and her mind registered what she was looking at before the rest of her had finished running. Ulna, most likely. Possibly the radius, too. The angle was bad. The kind of bad that meant the bone had moved, not just cracked. Tobin was conscious, which was both good and terrible. Conscious meant he could feel all of it. 3 ranch hands stood around him in a loose, helpless circle, their faces doing the thing men's faces do when they're confronted with injury and have no idea what to do about it. One of them, a big man named Clarence, who worked the Ruiz property, had his hat in both hands and was twisting it in a way that was going to ruin the brim. He got spooked, Clarence said, when he saw Maren coming. He meant the horse, a gray gelding now backed against the far fence, head high, eyes white-rimmed and still frightened. Tobin was leading him out, and something in the alley. I don't know what, a cat maybe. And the horse went sideways, and Tobin went down hard, and his arm... Clarence looked at the arm and stopped talking. Maren was already kneeling beside the boy. Tobin, she said, look at me. He turned his face to her. He was gray under his tan, the color that comes when the body is deciding whether to pass out, and his eyes were glassy and too wide. He'd been biting the inside of his cheek. She could see the blood at the corner of his mouth. I'm all right, he said, which was the thing people said when they were not at all right but couldn't afford to admit it. You don't have to be all right, she said. I need you to stay awake and look at me. Can you do that? Yes, ma'am. She ran her eyes over him quickly, not just the arm, all of him. His breathing was fast but even. No head injury she could see. No blood beyond what the dirt could account for. The arm was the problem, and it was a considerable one. Silas arrived behind her at a run, with Roy Casper a half step behind him, and at least 8 people from the dinner party trailing at various distances. Maren heard Cordelia Vane's voice somewhere in the gathering crowd, sharp and organizing, the voice of a woman who expected to be managing whatever situation she arrived at. Someone needs to ride for Dr. Calloway, Cordelia said. Dr. Calloway's in Clearfield, Roy said. That's near 40 miles. Then someone needs to ride 40 miles. At night, Roy looked at the sky, which was black and moonlit, but not generously so. That road has 2 creek crossings and a stretch through the canyon. 40 miles in the dark. We're looking at best-case morning. Cordelia hadn't finished thinking through this calculation before Maren spoke. We need to get him inside, Maren said. She was still looking at Tobin's arm, not touching it yet. Somewhere flat and with light. The saloon's the closest. You are not taking that boy into a saloon, Cordelia started. He needs a flat table and a lamp, Maren said, unless you'd like to offer your dining room. That stopped Cordelia for exactly 1 second. Clarence and the man beside him didn't wait for some discussion. They got their arms under Tobin with the careful awkwardness of men who weren't sure exactly how to do this, but were going to do it anyway. And Maren directed them left side lower. Watch his shoulder. Slow, and they moved him toward the saloon's back entrance with the halting focus of people, following instructions they trusted without entirely understanding why. Silas walked beside Maren. How bad, he said quietly. Bad enough that waiting until morning is a real risk, she said, equally quiet. The bone has moved. If it stays displaced that long, the swelling alone becomes a problem. And if there's nerve involvement, what does that mean? It means he might not have full use of the arm. Ever. Silas looked at her. Can you fix it? She didn't answer immediately. That restraint said more than a confident yes would have. I've done it before, she said. My father taught me. I've assisted him a dozen times and done it myself 3 times when there was no other option. She paused. This would be the 4th. That's not a no. It's not a yes either. Setting a displaced fracture without equipment. In a saloon, on a 17-year-old who's half in shock, she stopped walking for exactly 1 step, the way you do when you're making a decision that matters. There's a right way to do this and a wrong way. I need to examine him properly first. Then do that. Cordelia is going to have opinions. Cordelia always has opinions, Silas said. Doesn't outrank me in this town, and she doesn't outrank you in this situation. Do what you need to do. Maren looked at him. She hadn't expected that. Not that fast, not that cleanly. She turned back to the saloon door without saying anything else, but something had shifted in the line of her jaw, and anyone who'd been watching her carefully since she arrived in Red Hollow would have recognized it as the first time she'd looked, for even a moment, like she might actually be all right here. The saloon owner, Pete Doyle, was a practical man who had seen enough emergencies in his establishment to keep a long table clear near the back wall at all times. He had it cleared and wiped down before Maren had finished directing Tobin's transport through the door. They laid the boy down carefully. Tobin made a sound when his arm shifted and then clamped his mouth shut against it, the pride of a 17-year-old boy, refusing to cry in front of people warring visibly with the reality of what his arm felt like. You can make noise, Maren told him. Nobody in this room is going to think less of you for it. I'm fine, Tobin said through his teeth. You said that already. It didn't get more true. That startled something out of him, not quite a laugh, but a breath that was adjacent to one. His eyes focused on her a little better. Maren got her hands on his arm then, gently, systematically, working from the shoulder down. She kept her face neutral in the way her father had taught her. Your face is information. The patient reads it. If you look frightened, they become frightened, and a frightened patient is harder to work with than an injured one. She'd learned that at 10 years old and never forgotten it. What she felt confirmed what she'd seen. The radius was intact. The ulna had fractured mid-shaft. With lateral displacement, the broken end had shifted sideways out of alignment. The skin was unbroken, which was something. The circulation in his fingers was still good, which was something more. She pressed carefully at the brake site, and Tobin hissed and went rigid. I know, she said. I'm sorry. I needed to feel that. What? He swallowed. What's the verdict? The bone broke and moved. It needs to go back. Back. He processed this. You mean, set reduced is the technical term. The broken ends need to be realigned so the bone can heal correctly. Color left his face in a visible wave. That sounds like it hurts. It does. It hurts a great deal for about 4 seconds, and then the worst of it is done. She held his gaze. I'm not going to lie to you about that. Has anyone ever, have you? 3 times, she said. All 3 healed correctly. He thought about this. He was 17 and frightened, and his arm felt like it was on fire, and he was looking up at a woman he'd seen working in the sheriff's vegetable garden and hadn't thought much about, and he was trying to decide if he trusted her with something that mattered quite a lot to him. My father was a frontier doctor, Maren said, answering the question he hadn't asked yet. I learned from him. He was good at this. He taught me to be careful. Tobin looked at his arm. He looked at her. Okay, he said. Cordelia's voice cut through the low murmur of the gathered crowd. This is absolutely not acceptable. She stepped forward from the edge of the room, her dinner dress incongruous in the sawdust and lamplight of Pete Doyle's saloon. This woman is not a physician. She has no license, no credentials. She has experience, Silas said. He was standing 2 feet to Maren's right, arms crossed, and he said it in the flat tone he used when something was already decided, and he was simply informing people of the fact. Experience. Cordelia turned the word into something dismissive. Setting horses' legs in mining camps hardly qualifies. She didn't say horses, Roy Casper said, from the other side of the room. He said it mildly, without heat, which somehow made it more effective. If this goes wrong, Cordelia continued, directing herself at Silas now, if this woman cripples that boy, then that's a harder outcome than waiting 8 hours in the dark for a doctor on a road with 2 creek crossings, Maren said, without turning around. She was checking Tobin's fingers again, pressing at the tips to check blood return. But if we wait and the swelling closes around that displacement, I promise you the doctor is going to have a much worse problem to solve come morning. The room was quiet enough that the creak of the building settling was audible. She's right about the swelling, said a voice from the edge of the crowd. People turned. It was Hector Ruiz, who had come in behind the rest of them and been standing quietly near the door. I saw a man in Pueblo lose the use of his hand from waiting on a break like that. Doctor said if they'd gotten to it within the first 2 hours, it would have been simple. Cordelia looked at Hector with an expression that made clear she did not consider him a relevant authority. Hector met her gaze and did not look away, which was not something that happened to Cordelia Vane often. I need straight boards, Maren said to the room in general. Clean, if possible. About this long. She held her hands approximately 18 inches apart. And clean cloth. A lot of it. Pete Doyle had boards behind the bar, part of a broken shelf he'd been meaning to fix. He produced them in under a minute. A woman near the back door went out and came back with strips of sheeting. Roy Casper found a bottle of whiskey and set it on the table without being asked, which made Maren glance at him with something that was almost approval. For him, Roy said, nodding at Tobin. Not yet, Maren said. It'll thin his blood, and I need him still. She set the materials out with the economy of someone who'd done this in far worse conditions. River camps, mine tents, rooms lit by a single candle, and the smell of unwashed men and dust. The saloon, with its 4 lamps burning, was practically luxury. She looked at Silas. I need you to hold his upper arm, just below the shoulder. Firm. Don't let it rotate. He moved without hesitation, came around to the other side of the table, and positioned himself exactly where she pointed. Like this, she adjusted his grip 2 inches, like that. And don't react when he moves. Stay still. Understood. She looked at Tobin again. He was watching her with the focused, slightly desperate attention of someone who has decided to put their trust in a thing and is now committed. Don't look at your arm, she said. Look at me. Okay. Tell me something. What's the name of your horse? He blinked. What? The gray that threw you. What's his name? Pepper, Tobin said, confused by the question. He's not mean, usually. Something scared him. I know, it's not his fault. She had her hands positioned now, one above the brake, one below, her thumbs aligned on the lateral displacement she'd felt. Her grip was firm without being harsh. How long have you had him? 2 years. My uncle gave him to me when I started working for Mr. Ruiz. He paused. He said a man needs a horse he can trust. Your uncle sounds like a sensible man. She exhaled slowly, settling her own balance. He is. She moved. One controlled, deliberate motion, traction, and rotation simultaneously, the way her father had demonstrated, and then made her practice on a wooden model until she could do it in her sleep. Tobin screamed. The sound went off like a shot in the confined space of the saloon. Several people flinched. One woman near the back made a sound of distress. Silas held perfectly still, exactly as she'd told him to. Then Tobin's breathing changed. The frantic, ragged edge went out of it. Not gone, not calm, but different. The particular difference that comes when the source of the worst pain has shifted. Maren's hands stayed where they were, checking alignment by feel the way she'd been taught. She ran her thumbs carefully along the break site. The displacement was reduced. She could feel it. The ends were back. Not perfect, she didn't have X-ray vision, and couldn't be certain, but aligned in the way that her father's hands had taught her to recognize as correct. Breathe, she told Tobin. He was already crying silently, the tears just running without any of the sound left. His face had gone the deep red of someone who has just passed through something terrible and come out on the other side. He didn't seem ashamed of the tears. He was past that. Is it? He couldn't finish. I think so. She kept her hands on his arm, continuing to check. I need to splint it now. That part won't hurt the same way. Okay, he said, in a very small voice. You did well, she said. Better than most grown men I've worked with. She meant it. He could tell she meant it, which mattered to him more than he would have been able to explain. The splinting took another 10 minutes. She worked methodically, checking circulation before and after each wrap, adjusting the boards until the arm was immobilized in the correct position. The room watched. Nobody spoke. Cordelia was still present. Maren was aware of her at the periphery, a presence with opinions it was choosing, for the moment, to keep contained. When Maren finally straightened up and stepped back from the table, her hands had blood on them from where the skin had abraded against the ground. Not Tobin's blood, her own, from where she'd been gripping the rough edge of the board. She hadn't noticed. Silas noticed. He didn't say anything. He handed her a cloth from Pete Doyle's bar, and she wiped her hands without looking at them, still checking Tobin's fingers with her eyes. Wiggle them for me, she said. Tobin wiggled all 4 fingers slowly. Good circulation. She exhaled, and in that exhale was everything she hadn't let herself feel for the last 15 minutes. You need to be seen by Dr. Calloway as soon as he's back from Clearfield. He needs to confirm the alignment and tell you how long to keep it immobilized. Yes, ma'am. And stay off that horse for 2 days. He needs to settle. Yes, ma'am. A pause. You're not angry at him. At Pepper? No, she looked at the boy. Horses spook. It's not a moral failing. Tobin looked at her for a long moment. He was 17 years old, and he'd just been through something painful and frightening. And the woman looking back at him was the sheriff's wife, who people in town said was too rough and too forward, and not what Silas Danner should have chosen. She had a small cut on her right palm and sawdust on her skirt, and she had just put his arm back together with her bare hands in a saloon. And he thought, privately, that whoever was saying things about her was a fool. He didn't say any of that. He was 17 and exhausted, and his arms still throbbed with a deep, bone-level ache that he suspected was going to keep him up most of the night. Thank you, he said, Mrs. Danner. She nodded. That was all. But her jaw had a set to it that looked, if you knew how to read it, like relief. Silas walked beside her when they left the saloon. Crowd had thinned, people drifting back toward Cordelia's dinner party or their homes. Clarence and another hand had stayed with Tobin. Roy Casper was making arrangements for someone to fetch Tobin's mother, who lived on the north edge of town. The night air was cold and smelled like coming weather. Maren walked with her arms at her sides, her hands still bearing traces of the blood she hadn't entirely wiped away. Silas didn't fill the quiet. He'd learned that about her. In 4 weeks of marriage, she needed a minute after something difficult. She processed inward before she processed outward, and talking at her during that time was like interrupting someone mid-sentence. They'd gone half a block before she spoke. I need to tell you something. Her voice was level, but he heard what was under it, the slight roughness that came when she was holding something in check. That was the hardest one I've done. My father was always there the other times. He talked me through it. Silas didn't say anything right away. You did it, he said finally. I did it. She stopped walking. They were standing under the overhang of the feed store, out of the wind. She looked at her hands. I could feel the moment it went. Both ends, and I knew. She closed her fists and opened them again. My father always said that was the thing they couldn't teach you in a school, the feel of the bone through your hands. He said either you had it or you didn't. You had it. Apparently, she looked down the dark street. Cordelia is going to say it wasn't appropriate regardless of the outcome. Probably. She's going to say, I should have waited for the doctor, that I took a risk with that boy's health. Maybe, Silas said. But I watched your hands, and I watched your face, and you were not guessing. You knew what you were doing. She turned and looked at him directly, in the particular way she did when she was trying to determine if someone was saying the true thing or the convenient thing. He met her eyes without shifting. Who taught you to set a bone like that? He asked. He didn't know why he phrased it as a question. He knew the answer, her father, she'd told him. But something about the way she'd moved in that room, the way 20 people had stopped breathing and watched her hands, made him want to hear it again. Made him want to understand what exactly he was standing next to. My father, she said. He was a frontier doctor, I told you. You told me some of it. She was quiet for a moment. The wind picked up and moved something dry across the road between them. I started holding his lamp when I was 7, she said. My mother died when I was 6. There wasn't anyone else, so I went with him. She looked at nothing in particular, somewhere down the dark road. He never treated me like I was too young to understand things. That was either very wise or somewhat irresponsible of him. I've never decided which. It turned out well. Tobin Rust's arm might think so in about 8 weeks. She almost smiled. Not quite. My father, he believed everyone should know how to do basic things. Set a bone, treat a wound, know the difference between an infection that needs cutting and one that needs waiting. She paused. He said, ignorance costs more than knowledge ever does. He said that in mining camps especially, men would wait too long because they didn't know what they were looking at. By the time someone fetched a doctor, the infection had gone systemic and you'd lost the man. Silas listened to her. He had the feeling, not for the first time, that he had married someone considerably more complex than the letter she'd written him had indicated, and the letter had been more complex than he'd expected to begin with. How many he stopped, reconsidered the question. How much of what your father did could you do? She thought about it seriously, which he appreciated. Wounds, most of what comes with frontier work. Setting bones, yes. Fever management, yes, within limits. Obstetrics, I've delivered babies, but I'm not comfortable calling myself skilled at it. I've seen too much go wrong. She wrapped her arms against the cold. Anything requiring a surgical environment, no. I'm not a surgeon, and I know it. My father was, but he trained 20 years for it. You know more than anyone else in Red Hollow. I know more than most people in Red Hollow have ever needed, she corrected. There's a difference. The doctor's here most of the time. There's never been a situation where it mattered. Until tonight. Until tonight, she agreed. They stood there in the cold for a moment, 2 people who had been married 4 weeks and were still in the early process of finding the shapes of each other. You didn't hesitate, Silas said. When you came around that corner and saw him, you just moved. Hesitating helps no one. Most people hesitate. I'm not most people. She said it without vanity, simply as a statement of fact, the way she said most things. He looked at her in the lamplight from the feed store window, her dark hair slightly loosened from the evening's events, a good blue dress with a smear of something on the hem, her hands those broad, capable, calloused hands wrapped now around her own elbows against the cold. He thought about 4 weeks of shared breakfasts and quiet evenings and conversations that had surprised him with their depth. He thought about coffee poured before he'd asked for it. He thought about the vegetable garden turning green against all reasonable expectation, and Dolores Ruiz bringing bread to his kitchen, and Hector Ruiz standing up in a saloon and meeting Cordelia Vane's gaze without flinching. He thought about what his house had been like before she came to it, cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. I want to ask you something, he said, and I'd like an honest answer. I give honest answers, she said. I know. That's why I'm asking. He pushed his hands into his coat pockets. Are you all right here in Red Hollow? With how things have been. She looked at him carefully. That's a broad question. I know it is. She was quiet long enough that he thought she was going to deflect or redirect, the way she sometimes did when things got close to something vulnerable. I'm not settled yet, she said finally. I don't know if I will be. Some of that's Cordelia, and some of it's, she stopped. Started again. Some of it's the house. Still Clara's house. I know. He felt the weight of that admission, which she made without blame. It was the hardest thing about Maren. She said difficult, true things without wielding them like weapons. She just set them down in front of you and let you look at them. I'm not asking you to pretend it isn't, she added quickly. I know she mattered. I know she did matter. He looked down the dark street. She does, still. That doesn't go away. He paused. But I'm starting to think I've been holding on to the wrong things. The shawl, the curtains. Keeping things the same because changing them felt like admitting she was really gone. Maren didn't say anything. She let him have that sentence without rushing in after it. The curtains in the kitchen, he said. She spent a whole Saturday picking those out. She was very particular about it. He almost laughed, very quietly, at a memory. She'd have hated what I've done with the rest of the house. She had opinions about things. So do I, Maren said. He looked at her. You do, but yours come with reasons. Somewhere. She felt it, but she didn't let anything show on her face. She was still learning whether this man's kindness was intentional or accidental, whether he meant the things he said or said the comfortable thing without full thought. 4 weeks was not enough time to know. We should go back, she said. Someone should check on Tobin before we go home. Roy's there. I want to check his fingers again. Silas straightened. Then we'll check his fingers. They walked back toward the saloon, not touching, not performing anything for anyone who might be watching from behind a curtained window. Just two people walking in the same direction, which was, for the moment, exactly enough. Inside, Tobin was sitting up, which was an improvement. His mother had arrived, a small, fierce woman named Ada Rusk, who had taken one look at her son's splinted arm and then at Maren and said, "You're the one who did this," with an expression that could have gone either direction. "I am," Maren said. Ada Rusk crossed the saloon floor in 6 steps and took Maren's hand in both of hers and held it. She didn't say anything else for a moment. She just held the hand. "Thank you," she said finally. "His father's been gone 6 years. That boy's arm it's all I've got of him some days." She stopped herself, pressed her lips together, collected herself back into the fierce small woman she'd started as. "Thank you." Maren checked Tobin's circulation one more time. Fingers warm, good color, capillary return normal. She told Ada what to watch for overnight. She explained what doctor. Calloway would need to know when he returned, and she wrote it down on a piece of paper Pete Doyle produced from behind the bar, because she knew that people under stress don't retain verbal instructions reliably. Cordelia Vane stood near the saloon entrance. She had not left. She had been standing there with Gerald and 2 of the dinner party women, observing, and the expression on her face had been doing complicated things for the past half hour. She was a smart woman, and she knew it, which meant she was also aware when she had miscalculated something. She didn't like the awareness. It sat in her like a stone. She watched Maren write on the piece of paper. She watched Ada Rusk fold it carefully and put it in her apron pocket. She watched Tobin look at Maren with the specific expression of a boy who has been through something terrible and has decided that the person who got him through it is someone worth trusting. Cordelia turned and left. She didn't speak to Maren. She didn't acknowledge her. She walked out the saloon door with Gerald at her shoulder and her chin up and her skirts perfectly controlled, the walk of a woman who is reassembling herself in motion. Maren watched her go, then she turned back to Tobin. "Try to sleep," she said. "It's going to ache. That's normal. Fingers go cold or change color. You have someone come find me." "Yes, ma'am." He paused. "Mrs. Danner? Pepper, do you think he's all right out there? He gets anxious when he's tied long." Maren looked at the boy for a moment. He was lying on a table in Pete Doyle's saloon with a broken arm and a splint and a night of pain ahead of him, and he was worried about his horse. "I'll look in on him," she said. She did. She went around to the back of the livery and found the gray gelding still tied, still tense, head high, and eyes showing too much white. She talked to him quietly for a few minutes. Nothing particular, just sound and presence. Her hand moving slow and steady on his neck until the muscles under her palm began to release their brace. He dropped his head. He exhaled. Maren stood there in the dark, with a frightened horse in the cold Wyoming night. One hand on his neck, her dinner dress ruined at the hem, her arm aching where she hadn't noticed she'd strained it. She thought about Silas, asking if she was all right here. She thought about Ada Rusk holding her hand. She thought about Tobin saying yes, ma'am, to everything she told him. Not because she was the sheriff's wife, but because she'd earned it in that hour in that saloon. She hadn't come west looking to earn anything. She'd come west looking for somewhere to put herself where she wouldn't be wasted. She hadn't expected that the town would fight her for every inch of it. She also hadn't expected that winning even 1 inch would feel like this. The horse shifted his weight and leaned into her hand, the way horses do when they've decided to trust something. She stayed until he was calm. Then, she walked home through the dark and cold of Red Hollow, Wyoming, in October of 1887, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, she did not feel entirely like a stranger. Dr. Calloway came back from Clearfield on a Thursday, 2 days after Tobin Rusk's arm had been set, and his examination took less than 10 minutes. He was a small man, Dr. Calloway, somewhere in his mid-50s with a white beard trimmed close and the permanently tired eyes of a physician who covered too much territory for one person. He'd been the only doctor within 40 miles of Red Hollow for 11 years. He'd seen things go wrong that should have gone right, and right that should have gone wrong, and he had long since stopped being surprised by either. He unwrapped Maren's splint carefully, examined the arm, pressed along the fracture line with his fingertips in a way that made Tobin hold his breath, checked circulation, checked sensation, and then rewrapped everything with the efficiency of a man who had done this particular task many times. Then he turned around and looked at Maren, who was standing near the window of Ada Rusk's small parlor with her arms at her sides, waiting. Mid-shaft ulna, he said. Clean reduction. Good alignment. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. Her father was Orson Whitlock, Silas said from the doorway. He'd come along without Maren asking him to, which she'd noticed and not mentioned. Dr. Calloway looked at Maren differently then. Something moved through his expression recognition, and something adjacent to respect. I read 2 of his field papers. The one on hemorrhage management in subsurgical conditions. He paused. He was your father? He was. He was a remarkable physician. I know, she said it simply, without false modesty or performance. He trained you, from the time I was 7. Formally, as much as was possible without a medical school, she looked at Tobin's wrapped arm. He believed in teaching anyone who was willing to learn. Dr. Calloway was quiet for a moment. Then he said, carefully, in the way of a man trying not to say the wrong thing, you did the right thing. Waiting for me would have been a mistake. The swelling the next morning would have made reduction considerably more difficult. That's what I told Cordelia Vane, Maren said. The doctor looked at her again. I imagine she had opinions. She generally does. He almost smiled. I've been practicing medicine in this county for 11 years. Cordelia Vane has had opinions about 6 of my decisions that I can recall. He picked up his bag. She was wrong about 4 of them. He left. Ada Rusk showed him out, and in the brief privacy his departure created, Tobin looked at Maren from the settee where he was sitting with his arm in its sling. Did you know he'd say that? Tobin asked. That you did it right. I hoped. She picked up her coat from the chair. I wasn't certain. You can feel that something is right and still not be completely sure. That's a scary thing to say. It's an honest thing to say. She buttoned her coat. The alternative is to pretend to more certainty than you have, and then you stop being careful. Tobin thought about this. My uncle says something like that. He says the men who scare him most are the ones who are sure about everything. Your uncle, Maren said, keeps sounding smarter. Story, as stories do in small towns, had moved through Red Hollow faster than either Maren or Silas had. By the time they walked home from Ada Rusk's house Thursday morning, it had already been reshaped and elaborated by several rounds of telling. Some versions were accurate, some were not. One version, which Roy Casper reported to Silas with barely contained amusement, had Maren setting the bone with one hand while restraining a panicked horse with the other. Another had Cordelia Vane fainting, which hadn't happened, and which Cordelia would have found professionally offensive. What was consistent across all versions was the saloon going silent. Everyone who had been there agreed on that detail. The moment Maren's hands came up from the table, and Tobin's breathing changed, and the screaming stopped, the silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it, the kind that meant something had shifted. Clarence stopped Maren outside the feed store on Thursday afternoon. He still had his hat in his hands, which seemed to be where his hat lived when he was uncertain about something. "Mrs. Danner," he said. "I wanted to. I should have said this sooner. We were standing right there, me and the others, and none of us." He stopped. "None of us knew what to do. You did. You carried him in carefully," Maren said. "That mattered. You didn't jostle the arm. I was guessing. You guessed correctly." She looked at him. "That also matters." He put his hat back on. He seemed to feel better for reasons he probably couldn't have articulated. Two other things happened that Thursday. Neither was large. Together they added up to something. First, a woman named Pearl Hartigan knocked on Maren's door in the late afternoon with her 8-year-old son, Jesse, who had a gash on his forearm from catching it on a fence nail. Pearl was nervous visibly, almost apologetically nervous, the way she'd been taught to be when imposing. She explained 3 times that she'd tried to clean it herself and that she knew it was probably fine and that she didn't want to bother anyone. "You're not bothering anyone," Maren said. She brought them inside. She cleaned the wound properly, which stung and made Jesse clench his jaw with the bravery of an 8-year-old determined not to cry. She examined it, determined it didn't need stitching, but needed a proper bandage and watching for 3 days. She told Pearl exactly what to look for. She wrote it down. Pearl Hartigan looked at the piece of paper. She looked at Maren. "I didn't know who else to go to," she said. "Dr. Calloway's out on a call, and I didn't know." "If it were an emergency, you could have found him," Maren said. "This needed attention, but it could wait for me." She paused. "You did the right thing coming." Pearl Hartigan, left with her son and her piece of paper, and the slightly dazed expression of someone who'd expected a different kind of interaction. The second thing that happened was Roy Casper sitting down across from Silas in the office and saying, without preamble, "You know people are going to start coming to her." Silas looked up from his paperwork. "What people?" "Injured people. Sick people. People who need something and can't wait on Calloway." Roy settled back in the chair. "Already starting. Pearl Hartigan was at your door this afternoon." "I know. Is that all right with her, with Maren?" Silas thought about it. It was not a simple question. "I'll ask her," he said. He did that evening after supper. She was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside her, reading a handwritten notebook that he recognized as one of her father's. She had 3 of them in the trunk, pages filled with her father's cramped clinical notes. She did this sometimes in the evenings, reading through them the way other people read letters. "Roy thinks people will start coming to you," Silas said, "for medical things. When Calloway's not available." She looked up. "Roy's probably right. Is that something you want?" She set the notebook down. She thought about the question with the seriousness she brought to things she didn't want to answer wrong. "It's something I'm good at," she said finally. "Whether I want it?" She turned the notebook over in her hands. "My father spent 20 years going where he was needed. I spent 20 years watching him. I'm not sure I know how to not go when someone needs me. That's not the same as wanting it." "No," she agreed. "It's not." She picked up her tea. It was cold, and she drank it anyway. "I don't want to overstep Calloway," she said. "It's his practice. This is his town. He knows what you did for Tobin." He didn't seem bothered by it. He was gracious about it. "That's different." Silas leaned against the doorframe. "Why don't you talk to him directly?" She looked at the notebook. "That," she said after a moment, "is a reasonable suggestion." She said it in a way that implied she was surprised he'd made it. He wasn't sure how to feel about that, so he just nodded and went back to the parlor. Maren called on Dr. Calloway at his office the following morning. His office occupied 2 rooms in a building on the east side of the main street, clean and functional and smelling of the particular combination of carbolic and leather that she'd grown up associating with medical spaces. He had good instruments, well maintained. That she noticed this the way she noticed everything: cataloging, assessing, filing. He received her without surprise, which suggested he'd been expecting the visit. Sit down, Mrs. Danner. She sat. I wanted to be direct with you, she said. About what happened with Tobin and about what might happen going forward. Appreciate direct, he said. I'm not a physician. I don't have a license and I'm not practicing medicine. She kept her voice level. But I have skills, and people are going to come to me when you're not available. That's already started. I'd rather you know about it than hear it secondhand. Calloway sat back in his chair and looked at her with the assessing expression of a man taking inventory. What did your father teach you? He said. Specifically, she told him. Not everything that would have taken days, but the practical outline. Wound management, fracture reduction, fever differentiation. What she could handle and what she knew was beyond her capacity. He listened without interrupting. He asked 3 questions, all of them clinical, and seemed satisfied with the answers. Your father's paper on field hemorrhage control, he said. His technique for packing wounds before he had proper gauze. Do you know it? I assisted him develop it, Maren said. He practiced on everything he could find until he understood the physics of it. I've used a version of it twice. Calloway paused. Both times it worked. He folded his hands on the desk. You understand, I can't formally sanction anything. Legally, my hands are tied, I understand. But if you were to informally handle minor things when I'm away, with the understanding that anything serious waits for me, and that you send someone for me the moment something is beyond your capacity, that's exactly what I'd do anyway. Then we understand each other. She stood, he stood. Mrs. Danner, he said as she reached the door. Your father. Was he well at the end? Something crossed her face briefly. He was tired. He'd been tired for a long time. She looked at the doctor's instruments on the wall, the familiar shapes. He died in the spring 2 years ago. A fever. The thing he'd spent his life treating. She paused. He thought that was funny. In his way. It sounds like he was a man worth knowing. He was. She put her hand on the doorframe. He was also difficult and stubborn, and he had no patience for people who knew less than he did, which was most people. She almost smiled. He was not easy to live with, but he was exactly who you wanted in the room when something went wrong. Calloway nodded. So are you, he said, from what I hear. It was in the 5th week that the creek situation came to a head. Maren had been gathering information the way her father had taught her to gather medical information quietly, from multiple sources, without tipping her hand until she understood what she was actually looking at. Hector Ruiz had mentioned the creek twice more. She'd asked Dolores, who'd asked Hector, who'd gone and walked the creek bank himself and come back with mud on his boots and a specific kind of tight anger on his face. Someone put in a diversion, he told Maren, when she came to the Ruiz property on a Tuesday with eggs from a trade with Pearl Hardigan. Up past the Fenwick line. There's a channel cut that wasn't there last year. New timber work. The Fenwicks cut it? I don't know that it's them. The land up there, Cale Fenwick, owns the property, but he leased the north section 2 years back to a man named Durst. Barrett Durst. Nobody knows much about him. What does Durst do with the land? That's a thing I've been wondering. Hector scraped mud off his boot on the fence post. He's not ranching it. He's got 3 men working up there, but no cattle I've ever seen come off it. Maren carried this home and put it beside the other pieces she'd been accumulating without intending to a comment from Clarence about water pressure dropping on the Ruiz boundary, a mention from Ada Rusk that her neighbor's well had gone shallow in August for the first time in memory. That evening she put it in front of Silas, not dramatically, not as a presentation. She just laid the pieces out on the kitchen table, the way she laid out medical information when she was trying to make a diagnosis. He looked at it. He picked up his coffee cup, held it without drinking. Durst, he said. You know him? I know of him. He came through about 2 years back. Quiet. Paid his lease fee to Fenwick in cash, which Fenwick mentioned because it was unusual. Silas set the cup down. I've ridden past that north section twice. Never seen anything that made me stop. Would you go back? He looked at her. You think it's something. I think someone cut a water diversion that's affecting 3 properties downstream, and nobody's talked about it formally yet, because everyone's waiting to see if someone else says something first. She folded her hands on the table. In my experience, problems like that don't resolve themselves. In your experience, frontier camps had water disputes constantly. They never stayed small. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. I'll ride up there Thursday. Can I come? He looked at her with an expression that had multiple things in its surprise. Consideration, the brief resistance of a man accustomed to doing his work alone, and then something else that overrode the resistance. Can you ride? I grew up in frontier camps. What do you think? He almost smiled. Thursday morning then, early. Thursday morning came gray and cold, with the smell of snow somewhere in the distance that hadn't arrived yet. They rode north from town just after first light. Maren on a roan mare borrowed from Hector Ruiz. Because her own horse was still 2 weeks away from arriving, she'd shipped it separately. It having been a complicated logistical negotiation she preferred not to revisit. The mare was steady. Maren had spent 20 minutes with her before they left, which Silas had watched from a distance and not commented on. They rode mostly in quiet, which they'd gotten better at together. The silence between them had changed over 5 weeks. It had lost the cautious quality of strangers, sharing a space, and taken on the more comfortable character of two people who simply didn't need to talk to feel the presence of each other. The north section of the Fenwick lease was about 6 miles out, past a creek crossing and through a stand of cottonwoods that had already gone bare for the season. When they came through the trees onto higher ground, Maren saw the diversion immediately. It wasn't subtle, close up. A channel had been cut perpendicular to the main creek, running west, lined with timber and packed earth. Recent work, the timber was still pale where it had been cut. The main creek ran noticeably lower on the far side of the cut. Silas studied it without speaking for a long moment. How much water is that taking? Maren asked. Hard to say exactly. A significant portion. He looked west, following the line of the diverted channel. Where's it going? They followed it. The channel ran about a quarter mile before feeding into a holding pond, artificial, recently dug, ringed with fresh-turned earth. At the far end, a structure of some kind was under construction. Raw lumber, partially roofed. 3 men working. The men saw them at roughly the same time. One of them came forward. He was heavyset, somewhere in his 40s, with a flat, watchful expression that Maren had seen before on men who were accustomed to having conversations they needed to control. Sheriff, the man said. He'd identified Silas's badge before he was close enough to read the name. Morning. Silas kept his horse still. Barrett Durst? That's right. Durst stopped about 10 feet away. His eyes went to Maren, assessed her without acknowledgement, went back to Silas. Something I can help you with. Just looking at this water channel you've put in. Wanted to understand what I'm looking at. Irrigation, Durst said. I'm developing the land. Developing it for what? Farming, eventually. He said it like a man reading from a prepared script. Water retention for the dry months. You got Fenwick's agreement for this? It's on his land. I leased it. The creek feeds 3 properties downstream, Silas said. The Ruiz Ranch, the Hartigan property, and he glanced at Maren. The McCready homestead, she said. She'd looked up the downstream properties before they left. Martha McCready, widow. Been there 12 years. Durst's eyes went to her again. This time they stayed longer. I don't believe we've met, he said. We haven't, Maren said. And you're here because... She's here because she's with me, Silas said. His voice hadn't changed. It was the same flat, informational tone he'd been using. But something in it had shifted its weight slightly, and Durst heard it because his eyes went back to Silas. This is legal, Durst said. The lease gives me water access. Water access isn't the same as water diversion, Silas said, especially if it materially affects downstream users. He looked at the channel, the holding pond, the half-built structure. I'm going to need to look at your lease agreement, and I'll be checking with Fenwick about the terms. You're welcome to. Durst spread his hands in the gesture of a man performing cooperativeness. I've got nothing to hide. Men who said they had nothing to hide were, in Maren's experience, either completely innocent or comprehensively prepared. Durst, she thought, was the second. She didn't say this on the ride back. She said something adjacent to it. He knew you were coming, she said. Silas looked at her. What makes you say that? The way he answered. No hesitation. No reaching for explanations. She watched the cottonwoods go by. He's had that conversation before, or he practiced it. That's observational. So is medicine. She adjusted her grip on the reins. He also looked at the holding pond before he answered about the farming. Just for a second, like he was checking whether his story fit what you could see. Silas thought about this. He's lying about the farming, Silas said. It wasn't quite a question. I don't know what he's doing up there. It's not farming. The structure's wrong for it. She paused. My father worked a gold processing camp in Colorado for 3 months. The equipment they were building required water supply and retention. She looked at Silas. The pond is deep. That's not irrigation deep. That's processing deep. Silas turned his horse toward town. His jaw had the set it got when he was thinking through something with all of himself. If someone's running a mining operation on leased grazing land, he said slowly, without the correct permits, and diverting a shared water source without the downstream user's consent, Maren said, then there are several things wrong at once. Yes. He rode quietly for a while. You figured this out from Hector mentioning a slow creek and some boot mud, he said. And from you telling me about the water dispute 2 years ago, and from what Roy said about the McCready property going shallow. She looked ahead at the road. Information is like that. Individual pieces mean nothing. Together they tell you something. Your father teach you that too? He said a good diagnosis requires more listening than looking. The patient tells you what's wrong if you ask the right questions. She glanced at Silas. Towns work the same way. He was quiet again. Then you're useful to have along. It was not a romantic compliment. It was a direct, honest assessment, which was, she was beginning to understand exactly how Silas Danner expressed things he meant. She felt more from that plain sentence than she would have from something polished. Don't tell Cordelia, she said. He laughed a real one, not the brief social variety. She'd heard him laugh before, but not like that, not unguarded. It was a good sound. She filed it away without examining why. What happened over the next 10 days moved fast, the way things do when they've been building underground for a long time and finally find a surface. Silas went to Cale Fenwick. Fenwick, it turned out, had signed a lease with Durst that gave water access but explicitly did not include diversion rights. Durst had built the channel anyway, and Fenwick had either not noticed or had decided not to notice, which were different problems. Silas sent a letter to the Territorial Land Office. He sent another to the Mining Commission. Roy rode out to the McCready property and confirmed that Martha McCready's well had dropped 8 inches in the past 2 months, the first time in 12 years of record that it had done so. Meanwhile, Cordelia Vane was having her own adjustments. The saloon incident had not destroyed her position. She was too well established for that, and Red Hollow too settled in its hierarchies. But the ground had shifted under her, and she was a woman who could feel ground shifting. The dinner party had ended in a way she hadn't designed. Maren had left before she could be publicly dismissed, and she'd left to do something that the whole town was now talking about. The magistrate, Putnam, had asked Silas before he left town to convey his admiration to Mrs. Danner for her composure and competence. Silas had relayed this to Maren with a neutral face. Maren had said thank you with an equally neutral face. Cordelia had heard about it from 3 different people in 2 days. She was privately reassessing, not abandoning her position, not admitting error, but reassessing in the way of a smart woman who understands when a situation has changed and adjusts accordingly. She sent a note to Maren the 2nd week of November. The note said, I understand you have been of assistance to Pearl Hartigan and several others while Dr. Calloway has been occupied. I wonder if you would be available for tea at 3 o'clock Thursday. Maren read it twice. She showed it to Silas that evening. He read it. He set it on the table. What are you going to do? He asked. I haven't decided. What are your options? Go. Don't go. She picked the note back up. Say yes and mean it. Say yes and don't mean it. Which one are you leaning toward? She was quiet for a moment. Going, meaning it. She folded the note. I'm not interested in a false truce. If she wants to talk, we'll talk. If she wants to perform civility for the town, I'll disappoint her. Silas watched her. You're not angry at her, he said, slightly wondering. She stopped, reconsidered. I'm tired of it. There's a difference between anger and just being worn out by something. She set the note on the counter. She's not a stupid woman. She's not even a cruel one, exactly. She's a woman who decided a long time ago that the only way to matter was to control things, and she's been doing that so long she doesn't know how to stop. That's a generous read. I've had time to think about it. Most people wouldn't bother. She shrugged, a small, honest gesture. I grew up around men in pain, injured men, sick men, men who were scared and couldn't say so. You learn to look at what's underneath the behavior. She picked up her tea. Cordelia Vane is scared. She's been scared since the moment I stepped off that train. I just didn't know what of, until lately. What is she scared of? Maren looked at him. Becoming invisible, she said. Same thing everyone's scared of. Silas looked at his wife across the kitchen table in November in Wyoming, with the cold pressing at the windows and the lamp burning between them, and thought, 20 years traveling frontier camps, holding her father's lamp, learning to look underneath things. He thought about what she'd told the boy, don't watch your arm. Watch me. He thought about her standing in the dark with a frightened horse, talking it down with nothing but her voice and her patience. He thought about what he'd told himself when he'd placed the matrimonial ad, that he needed practical, that he was past the point of wanting. That practical was enough and probably more than he deserved. He was beginning to understand, with the slow certainty of a man who doesn't move fast on internal things, that he had been wrong about this. Not wrong about Maren being practical. She was deeply, genuinely, usefully practical. But practical wasn't the whole of it. It hadn't been the whole of it for some time now. He didn't say any of this. He was not ready to say it. He wasn't sure he'd know how. But he poured her tea before his own the next morning, same as he had the morning before, and the morning before that, and Maren looked at the cup he set in front of her with the same expression she always did, complicated, warm in a way she was still learning to let out, and they ate breakfast together in the particular quiet of two people who are becoming, by degrees, something neither of them had entirely planned. She went to tea with Cordelia on Thursday. She wore the blue dress again, which was the best she had. Cordelia's parlor was exactly as formal and beautiful as it always was. The china precisely arranged, the small cakes from the bakery on a proper stand. Cordelia herself was in dove gray, and her hair was perfect. And for the first 10 minutes, they talked about the most careful things, the weather, the road conditions, the upcoming territorial survey that everyone had opinions about. Then Cordelia set her cup down. I'm going to say something, she said, and I'd like you to let me finish before you respond. All right, Maren said. I managed this town for a long time. Cordelia's voice was controlled but not pretending. That was different from all their previous interactions, and Maren felt the difference. I managed it because somebody needed to, and I was good at it, and because it mattered to me that things were done correctly. She looked at her cup. Silas Danner was part of that. His choices, his household. I had expectations, I know, Maren said. I was unkind to you. The parlor was very quiet. You were, Maren said. Cordelia looked up. She had perhaps expected the deflection, the social smoothing, the it was nothing that women were expected to offer. She hadn't expected simple agreement. I had reasons, Cordelia said. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. My niece, she stopped. Lenora is a sweet girl who deserves a good marriage. I wanted it to be Silas. I thought he wanted it too, or could want it, if given time. She folded her hands in her lap. He didn't want it. I know that now. I knew it then. She pressed her lips together briefly. I was not ready to accept it. I understand that, Maren said. You don't have to forgive me. I know I don't. They looked at each other across the tea table. Two women who were not going to pretend the past 2 months had been anything other than what they'd been. I'm not asking for friendship, Cordelia said carefully. I suppose I'm asking to start again. From where we actually are. Not from where I wanted to be. Maren thought about what she'd said to Silas. Becoming invisible. Same thing everyone's scared of. She thought about her father, who had treated difficult patients his whole life. Who said the most important thing in medicine was not technical skill, it was the willingness to sit with people in their worst moments, without flinching away. I'll have tea with you on Thursdays, Maren said. Cordelia looked at her. That's it, she said. Just tea to start. Maren picked up her cup. Things generally go better when you start with something small and true rather than something large and uncertain. Cordelia was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her own cup. Thursday tea, she said. Thursday tea, Maren agreed. It was not a friendship, not yet, and might never be entirely one. But it was something real, which was more than either of them had expected to walk out of that parlor with, and it would have to be enough. Outside, November was settling hard over Red Hollow. The creek dispute was working its way toward resolution through channels Silas was navigating with the same quiet thoroughness he brought to everything. Tobin Rusk was healing and starting to work one-handed, which everyone who knew him agreed was both inadvisable and completely predictable. Dr. Calloway had left a note at Maren's door with a list of supplies he was ordering that she might find useful, which was the most formal endorsement she was likely to get, and she knew it. And in the house at the edge of town, the curtains Clara Danner had chosen on a careful Saturday were still in the kitchen window. But the shawl was off the coat rack, and the house was warm. And every morning, without fail, there were 2 cups of coffee on the table before either of them had sat down. And neither of them could have told you, by now, whose habit it had started as. The letter from the Territorial Land Office arrived on a Monday morning in the 2nd week of November, and Silas read it at the kitchen table while his coffee went cold. Maren watched his face while he read. She had learned his face over 6 weeks of marriage, the way you learn a landscape you cross every day, the particular set of his jaw when something was complicated, the slight tightening around his eyes when he was deciding something, the stillness that meant he was angry in a way he hadn't finished processing yet. He set the letter down. "The diversion is illegal," he said. "The Mining Commission confirms Durst has no permits for extraction on that land. The lease explicitly prohibits subsurface operations." He turned the letter over as if there were more on the back. There wasn't. And Fenwick signed something 2 months ago that he apparently didn't read carefully enough. What did he sign? An addendum to the lease. Durst brought it to him, said it was a water access clarification. Silas picked his coffee up, found it cold, set it back down. It wasn't. It was a modification granting Durst extended surface rights. Fenwick signed it without having anyone look at it first. Maren was quiet for a moment. "Fenwick can't read well," she said. Silas looked at her. "How do you know that?" Dolores mentioned it. She said, "Cale Fenwick's wife does all their correspondence." She paused. "His wife has been in Laramie for 2 months visiting her sister." The silence in the kitchen had a particular texture. "So Durst waited," Silas said, "until the one person who would have read the document carefully wasn't there to read it." Maren folded her hands on the table. "That's not opportunism. That's planning." Silas looked at her for a long moment. He picked up the letter again, not to read it, just to have something in his hands while he thought. "I need to go out there," he said, formally this time, with the land office letter. "Durst won't go quietly." "No, he won't." He folded the letter. "He's got 3 men up there and possibly more I haven't seen. And whatever he's building, he's not going to walk away from it on my say-so alone." He stood. "I need to send a wire to the Territorial Marshal's office." "How long will that take?" "Days. Maybe a week." He went for his coat. "In the meantime, Durst knows I've been asking questions. He knows I went out there. He'll accelerate whatever he's doing," Maren said. "If he has a timeline, he'll compress it. That's what I do." He shrugged into the coat, checked his sidearm with the automatic habit of a man who'd been doing it for 15 years. He caught her watching. "I'm going to ride out to the Ruiz property and the Hardigan place. Tell them what I know. Tell them to keep their people away from that north section." "And Martha McCready?" He paused. "Roy can go to McCready. She doesn't—" He stopped himself. "She doesn't respond well to me. Old business, nothing criminal, but she'd rather see Roy than me." He put his hat on. "Will you be all right?" It was the first time he'd asked her that when he left in the morning. The first time it had occurred to him to ask, which said something about how things had been shifting between them without either of them naming it. "I'll be fine," she said. "Pearl Hardigan's bringing Jesse by for me to check his arm. And I promised Dolores I'd look at her youngest. He's had a cough 3 weeks that won't resolve." "A cough 3 weeks," Silas repeated, with the expression of a man who knew enough medicine to find this concerning. "Most likely nothing. Could be something." She stood and took his cold cup to reheat it. "I'll know better when I hear his chest." He watched her at the stove. "Maren," she turned. He wanted to say something. She could see it, the particular quality of restraint on a face that was working toward a sentence it didn't quite have yet. He was a man who thought in long, thorough loops and came out the other side at his own pace. "Be careful today," he said finally. It was not what he'd been working toward. They both knew it, but it was what he had ready, and she accepted it for what it was. "You too," she said. He left. She heard his boots on the porch boards, heard the horse, heard the street absorb him into the ordinary sounds of Red Hollow's morning. She stood at the stove with the reheated coffee in her hand and the house quiet around her. She thought about how long it had taken her to stop feeling like a visitor here. She thought about how it had happened so gradually. She couldn't point to a specific moment, just an accumulation of mornings and evenings, and the small repeated rituals of two people learning to share a space. Coffee. The lamp she moved to her side of the table because the light was better, and Silas had rearranged his papers without comment. The third hook on the coat rack, empty now, where she'd begun hanging her own coat without thinking about what used to hang there. She drank the coffee. Then she went to check on Dolores Ruiz's youngest child, because there was work to do, and she had never in her life solved a problem by standing still. The boy's name was Mateo, and he was 4 years old with enormous dark eyes and the dedicated focused cough of a child who had been coughing for long enough that he did it now without interrupting whatever else he was doing. When Maren listened to his chest with the small horn stethoscope that had been her father's, she heard what she'd been half expecting and half hoping she wouldn't. She kept her face neutral. "How's his appetite?" she asked Dolores. "Not good, not terrible. He eats half what he usually does. Fever. Low. On and off. I thought it was a cold that wouldn't go." Maren lowered the stethoscope. She looked at Mateo, who looked back at her with the frank, assessing stare of a small child deciding whether someone was trustworthy. "Your name's Mateo," she said. "Yes," he said, "that's a good name. My father knew a man named Mateo. He was a very fine horseman." Mateo considered this information seriously. "I like horses," he said. "I know. Your papa has good ones." She stood, looked at Dolores. "Can we talk in the other room?" Dolores's face did the thing mothers' faces do when they are managing fear in real time. They went to the kitchen. "His left lung has a sound I don't like," Maren said, keeping her voice steady and her words direct the way her father had always spoken to patients' families, on the basis that softening information delayed the decisions that needed to be made. "It's not pneumonia, not yet, but there's congestion settling deep. If it's not addressed, it could become serious." Dolores pressed both hands flat on the kitchen table. "What does he need?" "Dr. Calloway needs to hear this and make the determination. I'm not a physician, and I won't pretend to be one when a child's health is involved." She put her hand briefly over Dolores's. "But I want you to get him in front of Calloway today. Not this week. Today. I'll find out where he is. If he's on a call, I'll find out when he'll be back." She picked up her coat. "Don't wait on this." Dolores was nodding before Maren finished speaking, the nod of a mother who has had fear translated into action and finds action considerably easier to bear than fear. Maren found Calloway at the McCready property where he'd gone to check Martha McCready's well water at Roy's request. She rode the roan mare hard enough that the horse was blowing steam when she got there, and Calloway came out of the McCready barn to meet her with the expression of a man who had learned to read urgency in people's riding. She described what she'd heard in 45 seconds. He listened, asked 2 questions, and was saddling his own horse in under 3 minutes. "You did right to come," he said from the saddle. "I wasn't sure if I was overreacting." "You weren't." He gathered his reins. "I've seen that pattern go south in 2 weeks in a child that age. You were right to move fast." He looked at her from the height of his horse. "Your father's stethoscope?" "Yes. Good instrument. Good ears to use it." He turned his horse. "Come with me. I want you there. When I listen, I'll tell you what I'm hearing and why, if you want." She turned the mare and followed him. It was not an offer she had expected. It was not one she could turn down. Mateo, as it turned out, had a developing bronchial infection that Calloway caught early enough to treat with the medicines he had available. 3 weeks later, the boy was running in the Ruiz yard again, terrorizing the chickens, and Dolores Ruiz told Maren over the kitchen table that she owed her something she didn't have words for. "You don't owe me anything," Maren said. "I know what I owe," Dolores said with a firmness that ended the conversation. The situation with Durst resolved itself in the way that ugly things built on a bad foundation eventually resolved not cleanly and not without damage. The territorial marshal's deputy arrived on a Friday with 2 men, which was fewer than Silas had requested and more than he'd expected on the timeline given. Durst's operation on the north section was further along than the first visit had suggested. They had processed a significant amount of what turned out to be placer gold from the creek diversion, and had been planning to be gone before anyone with legal authority arrived with paperwork. They had miscalculated the timeline by about 48 hours. Silas came home that Friday evening with dried mud on his coat and a cut on the back of his left hand that he was pretending wasn't there. Maren saw it immediately. She said nothing for approximately 4 minutes, during which she finished putting supper on the table and waited for him to sit down. Then she said, "Let me see the hand." He looked at it like he'd forgotten it was there. "It's nothing," he said. "You've been holding it slightly away from your body since you walked in." She pulled her chair around his side of the table. "Let me see it." He put it out, not arguing. She'd noticed that about him. When she spoke with the particular directness she used for medical things, he complied without the resistance he might have shown someone else, as if he understood that this was a different kind of authority and one he respected. The cut was on his knuckles, deep enough in one place that it should probably be stitched, but had already been somewhat sealed by the drying. She cleaned it, which stung, and he sat still. "What happened?" she asked while she worked. "Durst's man. When we went to take him," he watched her hands. He decided to argue the point physically before he decided to argue it legally. And Durst himself. "In custody. The deputy's taking him to the territorial court next week." He looked at the table. "Fenwick's going to have to answer some questions about the addendum he signed. I don't think he understood what he was doing, but that's for the court to determine. Martha Macready's well. Once the diversion's removed, the creek should recover. Take some time." He paused. "She's been there 12 years. She wasn't going to lose her water without a fight." "I know." Maren finished the dressing, cut the cloth, tied it off. She didn't move away immediately, which was something he'd noticed about her. She didn't leave situations abruptly. Finish them. "You did a good thing," she said. "The water thing. It mattered to people who couldn't fight it themselves." "It's my job," he said. "Your job was to keep the peace and uphold the law. Riding out a second time, getting the land office involved, going up there with a deputy instead of waiting." She shook her head slightly. "That was more than minimum." He looked at her. This woman had a way of seeing exactly what he'd done and saying it plainly, without embellishment, without making it into something it wasn't. It was disconcerting, and also he was finding something he had come to depend on, without recognizing it until it happened. "Hector Ruiz stopped me in the street this afternoon," Silas said. He shook my hand. "Good." And Silas paused. He looked at his bandaged hand. He said that his wife told him that you're the reason he knew something was wrong in the first place, that you asked questions no one else was asking. Maren said nothing. She moved back to her own chair. "You don't want to take credit for that," he said. "I asked questions," she said. "You did something about the answers." "Maren." "What?" He shook his head. "Nothing." He picked up his fork. "Thank you. For the hand. Don't use it hard for 2 days. I have a county to run. You have a deputy. Let Roy use his hands for 2 days." He almost smiled. They ate. Cordelia Vane arrived at Maren's door on a Thursday in late November, and it was not a scheduled tea. She arrived at 9:30 in the morning, and she was carrying a basket, which was so unlike Cordelia's usual mode of approach that Maren stood in the open doorway for a moment trying to recalibrate. "I made too much soup," Cordelia said. She said it with the dignity of a woman who is doing something outside her comfort and has chosen to frame it as practicality. "Cold snap has everyone laid up, and I find I cook when She stopped. "I made too much soup." Maren stepped back from the door. Cordelia came in. She looked at the kitchen, at the order of it, the hanging herbs, the small shelf Maren had put up beside the window for her father's notebooks. She looked at the coat on the third hook. She set the basket on the table. "I owe you an apology that I gave you poorly the first time," she said. I said the right words, but I said them like they cost me something, which they did, but you shouldn't have had to feel that." Maren pulled the cloth off the basket and looked at the soup jar inside. Still warm. "Sit down," Maren said. "I can't stay long." Cordelia. "Sit down." Cordelia sat. It was Maren suspected, not something she did in other people's kitchens frequently. Maren put the soup on to warm and sat across from her. "The invitation for the dinner," Cordelia said. "The line at the bottom. Appropriate dress." "Yes, that was deliberate." "I know it was. I wanted you to feel wrong before you arrived." She said it flat, looking at the table, so that anything I said would land harder. She pressed her lips together. I've done that to people before. It's a thing I do when I feel threatened. Maren looked at her. Did I threaten you? You existed, Cordelia said. You walked off that train looking like someone who'd never needed to be delicate and didn't know what she was supposed to be apologizing for. And you were in the house I'd been... She stopped again. It doesn't matter what I'd been planning. The point is that I behaved badly, and I'd like to stop behaving badly, and I need to say it plainly instead of sideways. The kitchen was quiet, except for the soup beginning to move in the pot. All right, Maren said. Cordelia looked up. That's all? What else would you like me to say? Most women would. Cordelia started, and then stopped, because she was beginning to understand that Maren was not most women, and that continuing that sentence would demonstrate she hadn't been paying attention. I accept the apology, Maren said. I'm not going to pretend the dinner didn't happen. I'm not going to pretend the invitation line didn't happen. But I'm also not going to hold it against you indefinitely, because that's exhausting, and I have better things to do. Cordelia looked at her for a long moment. You really mean that, she said. It was slightly wondering. I generally mean what I say. Most people don't. I know. Maren got up to stir the soup. That's been a significant source of confusion throughout my life. Something happened on Cordelia's face that was close to a smile. Not quite, but close. They had soup. It was not comfortable, exactly too much history behind them, too much still being negotiated, but it was real, which was the thing that had been missing before. Two women sitting in a kitchen talking about a soup that was slightly oversalted, and about Martha McCready's water, and about Lenora, Cordelia's niece, who had apparently been courted seriously by a man from Cheyenne who had good prospects and a genuine affection for her. She'll be all right, Cordelia said, about Lenora. She deserves better than a man who'd have had her as a second choice. She does, Maren agreed. Silas wouldn't have been... Cordelia picked up her spoon. He wouldn't have been unkind, but he wasn't in love with her. He was just available for the idea of her. He wasn't ready, Maren said. And then, because Cordelia had been honest with her, I'm not sure he's entirely ready now. Cordelia looked at her. He pours your coffee, Cordelia said. I know. I've seen him do it. In the street. At the bakery, when he brings you coffee, and Roy is standing right there who he's known 15 years, and he pours yours first without thinking. She set her spoon down. Silas Danner does not do things without thinking. He's the most deliberate man in this county. She paused. Which means he's thinking about you all the time. Maren was quiet. She looked at the soup. He doesn't say much, she said after a moment. Came out more honest than she'd intended. He doesn't say much to anyone, Cordelia said. Clara used to joke that getting words out of Silas was like getting water from a stone. But Clara also said... She stopped. It's all right, Maren said. You can talk about her. Cordelia seemed to weigh this. Clara said that when he did say something, she paid attention. Because he never spent words on things he didn't mean. Maren thought about I need you, because you're Maren. Not yet said. Maybe somewhere still forming, working its way through the long, thorough loops of a man who thought before he spoke. I know, she said quietly. Cordelia picked her spoon back up. She had the expression of a woman filing things away. She was a reader of people. Cordelia, whatever else she was, and she read Maren then with the attention she usually reserved for social situations she needed to manage. What she saw settled something in her that had been unsettled since October. The soup's too salty, she said. A little, Maren agreed. I was distracted when I made it. The cold snap and the business with Durst and Gerald has been. She stopped. Gerald worries when I'm unsettled. He expresses this by following me around the house, asking if I need anything. That sounds difficult. It's very difficult. Cordelia paused. It's also very sweet. I haven't decided which it is more. She drank her soup anyway. December came hard and early, the way Wyoming winters did when they decided not to wait. The cold pressed in from every direction, and the town drew inward, the way small towns do more fires. More people in the saloon for warmth and company, more knocking on neighbors' doors just to confirm someone was still there. Maren's garden was finished for the season, the last of the turnips and kale pulled and stored in the cellar. The cellar was full. She'd spent the better part of October making sure of it, which Silas had watched without comment, and which had, she knew, made a particular impression on him when he went down there one November morning to find shelves that were solid in a way they hadn't been in years. He'd stood at the bottom of the cellar stairs for a minute. She'd heard him come back up. He hadn't said anything about it directly. He had, that same evening, fixed the loose board on the left side of the porch that had been needing attention since before she arrived, working in the cold dark with a lantern and a handful of nails until it was done. That was how they communicated, often not in declarations but in parallel actions, in things done for each other without announcement, a language that had developed between them, the way languages do between people who spend enough time in the same space. Tobin Russ came by in the first week of December. With his arm in the sling, Maren had replaced twice as the swelling reduced. He came on the pretext of delivering a message from Hector Ruiz, which he delivered in about 12 words and then stood on the porch doing nothing in particular. "How's the arm?" Maren asked. "Dr. Calloway says the alignment is good. He says I got lucky." Tobin looked at the arm. "I know it wasn't luck." "It was some luck," Maren said. "You didn't hit the ground worse. You didn't move it before someone got to you." Clarence was careful. "Mrs. Danner." He looked at her directly with the earnestness of a young man who has decided to say something and is going to say it regardless of awkwardness. "I know people were—" He started again. "I know some people in this town weren't right about how they treated you. When you came, I didn't say anything about it then. I was one of the ones who—" His jaw tightened. I laughed. When the other hands were talking, I laughed. The porch was cold. Maren's breath made small clouds. "I know," she said. He looked like that was worse than if she'd pretended not to. "I was wrong," he said. Yes, she wasn't going to soften it. He hadn't come for softening, and he was old enough to bear the plain version. "But you're here now saying so, which is more than most people manage." He nodded. He looked at the porch boards. "Pepper's going to carry something for you," he said. "Whatever you need moved, whenever you need it, that's from me." Not because Mr. Ruiz said to Maren looked at this 17-year-old boy with his healing arm and his working conscience. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. After he left, she stood on the porch in the cold for a few minutes. The town spread out from there, the main street, the feed store, Pete Doyle's saloon, the line of houses and businesses that made up Red Hollow's modest footprint. She could see two people she knew by name in the street. A month ago, she couldn't have said that. She went back inside. Silas was home early that day, which was becoming a pattern she'd noticed without commenting on. He came in, took off his coat, found her in the kitchen, and instead of going directly to his paperwork the way he used to, he sat down at the table. "Roy tells me Calloway's going to speak to the town council," he said, "about formalizing some kind of arrangement for when he's away." Maren turned from the stove. "What kind of arrangement?" He didn't say exactly. "But Roy says Calloway mentioned your name." He watched her face. She turned back to the stove. She said nothing for a moment. "I'm not a physician," she said. "Calloway knows that. An arrangement would need to be clear about what I can and can't do. What my role is." She stirred the pot. "I won't practice medicine. I'll assist. I'll handle what's within my capacity and know when to stop. That seems like exactly what you've been doing already. Informally. Informally is different from—" She stopped. "Council formalizes it? That's different. That's the town deciding it officially. Would that be a bad thing?" She thought about her father's notebooks on the shelf. She thought about Mateo Ruiz's lungs, and Tobin's bone, and Pearl Hartigan's son's arm, and the look on Calloway's face when he'd listened to the stethoscope and said good ears. "No," she said. "Not a bad thing. Then I'll tell Roy you're not opposed." She turned around. "Silas," he looked at her. "Is this—" She chose her words carefully. "Is this you making something happen? Or Calloway?" He held her gaze. "Does it matter?" She thought about it honestly. "Yes. Then it's both," he said. Calloway raised it. "I didn't argue against it. You could have. I could have." He didn't look away. "I didn't want to." There it was. Not a declaration, not anything that could be called romantic by any conventional measure. Just a man telling a woman that he had not used his influence against something she wanted, and doing it in a way that made clear he'd had to make a choice. She took a breath. "Thank you," she said. "Sure," he said. He'd meant to. This time they both knew he had. The night that broke the last of the distance between them was not dramatic. It was a Tuesday in the second week of December, and Silas came home close to midnight, which was unusual. Maren was still up, reading her father's notebooks by the kitchen lamp, which was also usual. He sat down across from her. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and she could see in the particular quality of his stillness that something had happened. There was a man on the South Road, he said. Traveler. He'd been out in the cold too long exposure, disoriented. Roy found him. Where is he now? Doyle's with Roy. He's all right. He put both hands flat on the table. He was about my age. Traveling alone, he looked at his hands. He'd been trying to get somewhere and taken the wrong fork and lost his bearings in the dark. Maren waited. He kept asking for his wife, Silas said, while he was confused from the cold. Before he came back around, he was quiet for a moment. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know who Roy was. But he knew he needed to get to her. The kitchen lamp made soft, unsteady light. When Clara died, Silas said, I told myself I was done with that. With needing someone that way. Because needing someone that way, and then losing them, he stopped. Started again. I thought the practical arrangement was better. Cleaner. I wrote that letter, intending to be practical. Maren didn't move. She let him have the space to get to wherever he was going. I've been telling myself these past 6 weeks that it's still practical, he said. That it just works better than I expected. That we suit each other. He looked up from his hands. It's not, he shook his head. That's not all of what it is. No, Maren said. It's not. When you set Tobin's arm, he said, and I was holding him still and watching your face, you had this. He searched for the word and couldn't quite find it. You weren't afraid. You were absolutely there, in that moment, doing exactly what needed doing. And I thought, he stopped. She waited. I thought, I don't want to be practical about this anymore. The notebooks were open between them on the table. Her father's handwriting, cramped and certain. Maren had come west with a specific expectation of herself, that she would be useful and contained, and would not ask for more than usefulness. That she would take the practical arrangement and make it work, because making things work was what she knew. She had not expected to be sitting in a kitchen in Wyoming in December, listening to a man like Silas Danner tell her something this true. I didn't come here to be loved, she said. I need you to know that. I came because I needed a place. I know, I don't expect. Maren. He put his hand over hers on the table. He said her name the way he said very few things with all of himself behind it, deliberate, without performance. I know what you expected. I'm telling you that I've run out of reasons to give you less than more. She looked at his hand over hers, the bandaged knuckles still showing the edge of white cloth. Her own hand, broad and brown and calloused, the ring his mother had worn, fitting on her finger the way it had apparently always been going to. This is a small town, she said. It's going to talk. It's already talking. He almost smiled. Roy told me Hector Ruiz told Pete Doyle that the sheriff married the best thing to happen to Red Hollow in 10 years. Roy is going to ruin your reputation for stoicism. Roy talks too much. He squeezed her hand once, brief and firm, and didn't let go. I'm not good at this. I want you to know I know that. I know it. He paused. She was more patient with it than most people would be. She said I showed up more in actions than words. He looked at the table. I've been showing up, you have, Maren said. I'd like to keep doing that, differently than I have been. He looked at her. If you want that. In all of her 20 years following her father through frontier camps, Maren Whitlock had learned to assess situations quickly and accurately. She had learned that hesitation, when the information was clear, cost more than action. The information was clear. Yes, she said. I want that. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He stayed at the table with her hand in his, while the lamp burned low, and they sat in the kitchen that was becoming more hers every week. In the house that was becoming more theirs every day. In the town that was still figuring out what to do with her, but was, by degrees, figuring it out. Outside, December cold pressed against every window in Red Hollow. Inside, it was warm. It had been warm for a while if either of them had been willing to say so. Now they were willing. Winter settled over Red Hollow the way it always did, without asking permission and without apology. By the third week of December, the creek had iced at the edges, and the main street turned to frozen ruts that caught wagon wheels and twisted ankles with equal indifference. The wood stacked on the Danner porch, stacked by Silas in October, added to by Maren in November when she'd traded 2 jars of preserved tomatoes to the Ruiz hands for an extra cord, was going down steadily. The cellar held. The house held. The 2 people inside it were, by degrees, holding too. Things between Silas and Maren did not transform overnight into something simple. That was not the nature of either of them, and it was not the nature of honest things. What happened was quieter and more durable than transformation. It was continuation. The same small rituals, the same parallel language of action, but with the pretense of practicality set aside. They had named what it was, sitting at that kitchen table in December lamplight, and naming a thing changes how you carry it, even when the thing itself remains the same. Silas still said little. He still left for work early and came home later than he should. He still had the crooked jaw and the permanent tired quality of a man who took other people's problems into himself and didn't know how to put them down at the end of the day. He was not transformed into an easier man. He was the same difficult, deliberate, fundamentally decent man Maren had married in an 11-minute courthouse ceremony, except that now he held her hand in the evenings without engineering a reason for it, and twice that December she woke in the night to find he'd gotten up for water and came back to bed and lay awake in the dark, with his thoughts, in the particular way of a man processing, something he couldn't resolve by morning. And instead of pretending she was asleep, she said, "Talk or don't." Fine. And the second time he talked, not about Clara exactly, but about loss in the way of someone circling a thing they're not ready to land on. She listened without fixing. That was what he needed. She understood the difference. Maren still had hard days. Days when Red Hollow felt too small and too loud with its own opinions. Days when someone said something sideways at the Mercantile, and she walked home with her jaw set and the specific exhaustion of a woman who is tired of being evaluated. She did not pretend these days didn't happen. Silas could read her face well enough by December to know when she came through the door whether the day had been one of those, and on those days he made supper and did not ask her to perform equanimity she wasn't feeling. That was love, as far as either of them had working experience with it. Imperfect and practical and real, not what the songs were about. Something better than the songs, actually, because the songs ended and this didn't. The town council met on the last Thursday of December, and Maren attended at Calloway's request. She sat in the 3rd row of the meeting room, which was a back room at the Mercantile that smelled of sawdust and old ledgers. Silas sat 2 rows behind her, which was deliberate on both their parts. She didn't want anyone thinking this was his initiative on her behalf, and he understood that without her having to explain it. Calloway presented the proposal himself. He was methodical about it, the way he was methodical about medicine systematic. Evidence-based, no dramatics. He described the coverage gaps in his practice, the distances, the frequency with which residents needed medical attention during his absences. He described what Maren had done for Tobin Rusk, for Pearl Hartigan's son, for the Ruiz child. He described her background, her training, the scope of what she could and could not do. He was precise about the limits. He said, twice, that she was not a physician, and that nothing about this arrangement would represent itself as equivalent to physician care. He said once that she was one of the most capable medical assistants he had encountered in 30 years of practice, and that her father had been a man worth studying. The room was quiet when he finished. Gerald Vane, Cordelia's husband, who sat on the council, asked the first question. He asked about liability, which was a reasonable question that Calloway answered with equal reasonableness. 2 other council members asked about compensation, about the scope of the arrangement, about what formal documentation would look like. Then the council member from the South District, a rancher named Aldous Pruitt, who had not been at the saloon the night of Tobin's arm and who had been publicly skeptical about the sheriff's matrimonial choices since October, said, "I want to be plain about something. We're being asked to formally recognize a woman with no medical degree as a what exactly? An official medical person? In a county that has a functioning physician. An assistant," Calloway said evenly. "To a functioning physician who cannot be in 40 miles of territory simultaneously. There's precedent for this," said Gerald Vane unexpectedly. "Military field medicine, railroad camps, frontier settlements without physician access." He looked at his papers. "It's not unheard of." Pruitt looked at Maren in the third row. You've heard the proposal. What do you say for yourself? She hadn't planned to speak. She stood anyway. I say what I've said to Dr. Calloway, and to anyone who's asked me directly, she said. I know what I can do and I know what I can't. I won't go past my knowledge and pretend it's medicine. If I'm uncertain, I stop and find someone certain. She looked at Pruitt without aggression, just directness. I've been doing this informally for 2 months. I've had exactly one situation that required physician confirmation afterward, and Dr. Calloway confirmed I made the right call on that one too. She paused. I'm not asking to be a doctor. I'm asking to be allowed to do what I already know how to do without pretending I don't know how to do it. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Your father was Orson Whitlock, he said. It was not a question. He'd done some reading before the meeting. Apparently. He was. He did work in the Colorado camps in the late 60s. He did, I was there. Pruitt looked at his papers. He looked at Calloway. He made the expression of a man who has come to a meeting intending to object, and has found his objections more difficult to sustain than he expected. The vote was 4-1 in favor. Pruitt was the one, which Maren respected more than if he'd voted with the others without meaning it. Afterward, in the cold street outside the Mercantile, Calloway shook her hand. We'll work out the formal details next week, he said. But the structure is this. You handle minor cases during my absences. You document everything. You send for me when it's beyond your scope, and we review cases together monthly. He paused. I'd also like to continue what we started at the McCready property. Teaching, if you're willing. She looked at him. You want to teach me? I want to pass on what I know to someone who can use it, he said. I'm 56 years old and I cover 40 miles of territory alone. That is not a sustainable situation. He looked down the cold street. Your father understood that. That's why he taught you. He looked back at her. Same principle. She thought about her father, about 20 years of watching him work and being taught and being trusted with more than most people would have trusted a girl and then a young woman with. About him saying, you're going to be able to do things people can't imagine a woman doing, and some of them are going to be angry about it, and some of them are going to be grateful. And your job is to do the thing regardless of which reaction you get. I'm willing, she said. Calloway nodded. He put his hat on. He went back inside because he'd forgotten his bag, which was so characteristic of him that she almost smiled. Silas appeared at her shoulder. 4-1, he said. Pruitt was honest about it. I respect that, so do I. He stood beside her in the cold. Calloway looked pleased. Calloway is a man who believes in using available resources efficiently, Maren said. This is an efficient solution to a practical problem. She paused. He's also, I think, a little lonely out here, doing this work alone. Silas looked at her. And you're going to fix that. I'm going to show up, she said. That's usually the thing that matters most. He put his hand at the small of her back, brief and warm through her coat. Not a performance. There was almost nobody in the street to see it. Just a man telling a woman, in the language they'd developed together, that he was paying attention. They walked home through the December cold, side by side. January was when Tobin Rusk's arm came out of the splint. Calloway removed the last of the bindings on a Tuesday morning in his office, with Maren present, and examined the healed bone with the careful thoroughness that characterized everything he did. He pressed along the former fracture line. He had Tobin flex and extend, rotate, grip. He made Tobin do things that made the boy wince and then made him do them again. Then he sat back. Straight, he said, good union. Full range of motion will take another few weeks of careful use, but the structure is sound. He looked at Tobin. You're going to have that arm your whole life, working the way it should. Tobin looked at his arm. He bent his fingers, straightened them, made a fist. He didn't say anything for a moment. His throat was working on something. Full use, he said finally. Full use, Calloway confirmed. Tobin turned to Maren. He was 17 and trying not to show how much this had mattered to him, and he was doing a poor job of it, and he was aware he was doing a poor job of it, which made the whole thing very human and very young. Mrs. Danner, he said, it healed because you kept it still and let it heal, she said. Your body did the work. You put it back so it could. She accepted this. It was true enough. Keep Pepper to a walk for another 2 weeks, she said, until you've built the strength back. Yes, ma'am. He was still looking at his arm. Then he looked up. My mother wants to know if you'll come to supper on Sunday. Maren glanced at Calloway, who was writing in his case notes and not looking up, but whose pen had slowed slightly. Tell her yes, Maren said. February brought the town council's formal written arrangement, which Calloway and Maren both signed in his office on a Wednesday morning. It was 3 pages of careful language, full of qualifications and scope limitations and documentation requirements. And Maren read every word of it twice before she signed it because she was her father's daughter, and he had taught her never to sign anything she hadn't read. She signed it. The pen felt heavier than it should have, or maybe just significant in a way she hadn't expected to feel. She'd come to Red Hollow with a battered trunk and a marriage contract and no particular expectation beyond usefulness. She had not expected to sign her name to something official in a physician's office and have it mean what it meant. She set the pen down. Your father would have appreciated this, Calloway said. He wasn't being sentimental. He said it factually, the way he said most things. He would have had opinions about the wording in paragraph 7, Maren said. Calloway looked at paragraph 7. Fair point, he said. She walked home with the copy of the agreement folded in her coat pocket and her father's notebooks waiting on the shelf in the kitchen, and she thought about what it cost to be useful in a world that kept trying to tell you that you weren't. Not everything, in the end. Not nearly everything. But enough that you knew the value of what you'd gotten. Spring came late to Wyoming that year, grudging about it, winter releasing its grip only by degrees. But it came. The creek recovered as the diversion timbers were removed, a slow process that Hector Ruiz oversaw himself, with Silas present for the first 2 days to manage the legal documentation and ensure Durst's men didn't reappear. They didn't. Durst's case had moved to the territorial court, and the outcome there was going to take time, but the immediate damage to the water supply had stopped, and that was what mattered to the 4 properties downstream. Martha McCready's well filled back to normal by the end of March. Roy Casper brought Silas the news, and Silas told Maren over supper, and Maren put her fork down for a moment and looked at nothing in particular with an expression that was privately satisfied. She's been there 12 years, Maren said. I know. You stopped something that would have pushed her out. We stopped it, he said. She picked up her fork. She didn't argue with this, because he was right. And because she had learned, over these months, that accepting a we was different from losing an I. You could be both. The woman who'd set the bone, and the woman who'd asked questions about the creek, and the woman who'd signed her name in Calloway's office, and the woman who sat at Silas Danner's kitchen table, those were all the same person. Usefulness didn't divide. It accumulated. In April, Calloway came to Maren with a question he'd been working up to for several weeks. The room next to my office, he said. The storage room on the east side. I've been thinking about cleaning it out. He said this with the same studied casualness he used when he was about to suggest something he considered important and didn't want to appear to be pushing. If we had a proper space, a second examination room, the arrangement would be more formal, more functional. Maren looked at him. You want to put in a treatment room, she said. I want to put in a treatment room that you run. With my oversight, when I'm present, and your independent judgment when I'm not. He paused. The council would need to approve the expansion. I believe they will. She thought about her father's instruments in the trunk. She'd gotten them out twice, used them, put them back. A habit of hiding things she hadn't fully examined. Yes, she said. I'll speak to the council. One thing, she said. What's that? My father's instruments. I'd like them used. Not put away. Calloway looked at her for a moment. He understood what he was being told and what it had cost to say it. Of course, he said. Cordelia came to the room's opening with a covered dish. This was, by May, not as surprising as it would have been in October. Cordelia and Maren had been having Thursday tea for 6 months, and the teas had moved from careful and formal to something that occasionally resembled actual conversation. They did not always agree. Cordelia had strong opinions about how things should be done, and Maren had the habit of pointing out when those opinions were based on social preference rather than practical reason, which annoyed Cordelia regularly, and which Cordelia had also, reluctantly, come to appreciate because nobody else did it. They were not friends the way women who had grown up together were friends. They were something more complicated and possibly more durable Two people who had started badly and chosen on imperfect evidence to try something else. The room itself was modest, cleaned out, whitewashed, furnished with a proper examination table that Calloway had ordered from Cheyenne, 2 lamps, a cabinet for supplies. On the wall beside the door, mounted on simple hooks, hung the instruments that had spent 20 years in Orson Whitlock's battered field kit: the stethoscope, 2 bone saws, a set of forceps, a probe, a bone-setting frame he'd modified himself from a design in a German medical journal. They weren't decorations, they were tools, available. Silas stood in the doorway looking at them. He'd come by at midday, between his morning rounds and whatever the afternoon had waiting. He did this, sometimes now stopped by where she was if he was passing, not for any particular reason, just because he could. "Your father's," he said. Yes, he looked at the instruments for a long moment. He was a man who understood the weight of tools, what it meant to use them well, what they cost the person who carried them. He'd be satisfied, Silas said. He'd have opinions about the cabinet, Maren said. But satisfied, she looked at the instruments. Yes, she said. I think so. He came to stand beside her, looking at the same wall. I need to tell you something, he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the instruments, not at her, which was how he approached things he'd been working up to. I wrote to the matrimonial service, he said, the one that put us in contact. I wrote to cancel the listing. Tell them I was no longer. He stopped. I should have done it immediately. When you arrived. I didn't, because he pressed his lips together. I wasn't sure of anything yet. I thought, if this doesn't work, she needs a way out. Maren was quiet. I canceled it last month, he said. I should have told you at the time. I didn't, because I wasn't sure how to say. He turned and looked at her then, directly. I canceled it because the idea of you needing a way out of here is something I'm no longer willing to plan for. The room was very quiet, with just the street sounds outside the window and Calloway moving around in the next room. You thought I'd want to leave, she said. I thought you might. I'm not an easy person to live with, Maren. I know that. I work too much. I don't say things when I should say them. He held her gaze. You could have someone easier. Easier isn't what I was looking for, she said. I know. But Silas. She put her hand on his arm. I'm not going anywhere. He looked at her hand on his arm. I know that now, he said. That's why I told you. It was the most complicated and honest thing he had said to her yet, which, given Silas Danner's general economy with words, was considerable. He understood what it meant, not that he'd doubted her, but that he'd been afraid to be sure of her. That the same man who could face armed outlaws without flinching had spent 6 months quietly terrified of hoping for something he couldn't control. She understood this completely. She had spent considerably more than 6 months feeling the same way. Come home for supper tonight, she said, early. I'll try. Don't try. Come. He looked at her for a moment. Then he almost smiled, the full version of it, the one that changed his whole face, that she'd seen only a handful of times and had started, privately, collecting. Early, he said. He came home at 5 o'clock, which was the earliest he'd arrived since she'd met him. The first community supper of spring was held in the 3rd week of May in the open space behind Pete Doyle's saloon, which had been used for this purpose for enough years that the ground was worn flat in a comfortable oval from generations of dancing feet. The whole town came, or enough of it that the distinction didn't matter. Maren had been asked to contribute the main dish, the request coming through Cordelia, delivered at Thursday tea with the careful neutrality of a woman who understood what she was extending, and had decided to extend it anyway. The main dish, Maren had said. The main dish, Cordelia confirmed. She was looking at her tea. People have been talking about your cooking since December. The soup you sent with Ada Rusk. The bread Dolores mentioned. She looked up. It's recognition, not charity. Maren had heard the distinction clearly. Cordelia had meant it clearly. She'd made a beef stew that fed 40 people. Built on the bones of every camp meal she'd ever cooked with her father, the deep stock, the turnips from the cellar's last stored root, the dried herbs she'd put up herself in September. It was not a delicate dish. It was the kind of food that fed people who'd worked all day in the cold and needed something that would hold them until morning. 3 people asked her for the method. She told them. Tobin Rusk arrived with his arm healed and his hat in his hand, and the particular brightness of a boy who has come out the other side of something difficult and still can't quite believe the coming out part. He danced twice with a girl from the Hartigan property, which his mother Ada watched from across the fire, with the specific expression of a woman who has worried about her son for 17 years and is being given, for one evening, a reason to stop. Hector and Dolores Ruiz danced together badly and with great enthusiasm. Mateo, 4 years old, ran between everyone's legs until Dolores caught him and held him on her hip, where he fell asleep inside 20 minutes despite the noise. Doctor. Calloway stood at the edge of things with a cup of punch he wasn't drinking, watching the town he'd served for 11 years with the slightly removed expression of a man who is more comfortable at the edge of gatherings than in the middle of them. Maren went and stood beside him for a while. "Satisfied with the room?" he asked. Yes. She watched the fire. Pearl Hartigan brought Jesse in yesterday. The arms healed clean. I know. I checked it last week. He sipped the punch, which appeared to be worse than he'd expected. She asked me if you'd be there, specifically. She's used to me now. She's used to you, he agreed. That's the thing. It takes time, and then it's just normal. He looked out at the gathering. Red Hollow has a short memory for things it's gotten used to. In 2 years, people are going to forget what it was like before you were here. Maren thought about October, the platform, Cordelia's face, the shawl on the coat rack, the 11-minute wedding, the cold house. I won't forget, she said. No, Calloway said, you shouldn't. The memory of what it cost is useful. He looked at her. Your father understood that, he said once. In one of his papers, I paraphrase that the physician who forgets how frightened the patient was becomes a worse physician. He paused. The same principle applies to everything else worth doing. She thought about this. He also said that the memory of what it cost shouldn't stop you from accepting what you earned, she added. He said that part was harder. It usually is, Calloway said. He went to find better punch. She stayed at the edge of the fire. Silas found her there. He came from the direction of the saloon with Roy Casper, the two of them in the middle of what appeared to be a conversation that Roy was having more of than Silas, which was normal. He saw Maren at the edge of the firelight and said something to Roy that ended the conversation, and Roy wandered off with the practiced tact of a deputy who'd learned to read the terrain. Silas stopped beside her. They stood at the edge of Red Hollow's spring celebration, with the fire going and the music. Someone had a fiddle, and someone else had a mouth harp, and they were not in complete agreement about tempo and the voices of everyone they'd spent the winter with rising and falling in the warm May evening. Cordelia danced, Silas said. I saw with Gerald. He's worse at it than you'd think. She carried him through it. She did. He was quiet for a moment. She told me last week, she owed me an apology. For the dinner, he looked at the fire. She said she'd behaved badly, and that she was aware of it, and she wanted me to know she was aware of it. What did you say? I said I appreciated that. He paused. Then she told me you'd been having tea with her on Thursdays. Since November. You didn't mention it. You didn't ask. He turned and looked at her, and she turned and looked at him. And what passed between them in that look was the specific mixture of exasperation and understanding that belongs exclusively to people who know each other well enough to be annoyed by each other and choose each other anyway. I should have asked, he said. Yes, I'm asking now. How are the teas? Complicated, she said, and getting less complicated. She looked at Cordelia across the fire, dancing with Gerald, who was indeed worse at it than you'd expect. She's a good woman underneath the managing. She just spent so long managing that she forgot there was something underneath. You got to the underneath. I kept showing up on Thursdays. She shrugged. People reveal themselves to whoever keeps showing up. He was quiet. Is that how it worked with me? He asked. She considered this honestly. You revealed yourself faster than most, she said. You poured my coffee on day 28. That told me a great deal. He looked at her. That was an accident, he said. The first time she agreed. Not the other 40 times. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. The fiddle found the mouth harp's tempo, and for a stretch the music worked together, rising over the spring evening and the fire, and the assembled people of Red Hollow doing what people do when winter releases them, eating and talking too loud and dancing badly, and feeling for an hour that they had earned the warmth. Silas put his hand out. Maren looked at it. I don't know if I can dance, she said. Neither do I. He held the hand out. We'll figure it out. She took his hand. They were not graceful. He was too deliberate. She was too careful, and neither of them had the ease of people who'd grown up with regular dancing. They stepped on each other once. Silas muttered something under his breath. Maren told him to lead or follow, but pick one. He chose to lead. It improved marginally. It was also, despite all of this, undeniably good. Roy Casper watched from near the food table and said nothing to anyone, which for Roy Casper was an act of considerable restraint and genuine affection. When the song ended, Silas and Maren stopped in the half-dark between the firelight and the shadow, still holding each other's hands, the noise of the party around them, but not quite reaching. I married you because I thought I needed a practical arrangement, Silas said. She knew this speech was coming. She'd known it was forming in him for weeks, the way she'd come to know most of his interior movements. She let him have it. I was wrong, he said. Not about needing you. About why. He looked at her hands in her broad, calloused, capable hands that Red Hollow had spent the scene using as evidence against her. I need you because you're Maren. That's the beginning and the end of it. She had known this was coming. She was still not, when it arrived, entirely prepared for it. That was the thing about honest statements from people who chose them carefully. You could see them forming and still not be ready. I came west hoping to be useful somewhere, she said. I told myself that was enough. Useful was enough. Was it? She looked at him. No, she said, but it was what I knew how to want. She turned her hands in his, held them back. I didn't know how to want the rest of it. I didn't think I was going to get it. You got it, he said. I know. She looked at the fire, the dancing Cordelia and Gerald, Tobin with his healed arm, Hector and Dolores with their sleeping boy. She looked at the town that had judged her when she arrived and was by degrees doing something else now. Not perfect, not resolved entirely. Pruitt still looked at her sideways sometimes, and there were women in Red Hollow who would never quite know what to do with her. And she would have hard days and tired days, and days when the distance she'd traveled from everything familiar felt very large. But she was here. She had planted a garden and filled a cellar and set a bone and signed her name in a physician's office and sat across from Cordelia Vane on Thursdays and ridden north to a diversion site and listened to a small boy's lungs and ridden back through the cold. She had done these things. They were hers. I'm not finished, she said, with what I want to do here. I know. The room Calloway wants to keep teaching me. There are things I can learn that would help people in this county. I want to learn them then. Learn them. It's going to take time. Going to be Maren. He said her name the way he always did when she was running ahead of the conversation. I know. I'm not asking you to stop anything. He looked at her with the steady, direct clarity of a man who has thought something through completely before he says it. I want you to have all of it. The room, the work, the time it takes. I want you to have the whole life, not the practical version of it. She was quiet. This was the thing about Silas Danner. He said very little, but when he said something, he had meant it first. You're not going to regret this, she asked, marrying someone like me. Someone like you, he repeated. He shook his head. Someone exactly like you is what I mean. She let that land where it landed. Around them, the fiddle started again. The fire burned. Red Hollow, Wyoming, in the spring of 1888, went about the business of being itself imperfect and small and sometimes unkind, and also, underneath all of it, the kind of place that could hold people who needed holding. Silas kissed her there. At the edge of the firelight, which was something he had not done in public before, and which Roy Casper would absolutely report to everyone by morning, and which neither of them had much energy to concern themselves with. When he pulled back, she was looking at him with the expression he'd come to know, complicated, warm, neither soft nor guarded, just honest. Just Maren. Come on, she said. Your deputy is watching. Roy always watches. He's going to have opinions. Roy always has opinions. He kept her hand in his. Him. They walked back to the fire together, into the noise and light of the town that had tried to diminish her and hadn't managed it. There is something that does not appear in the songs about the frontier, about the women who crossed it, and the lives they built in the spaces everyone else found too difficult to inhabit. The songs remember the beauty and forget the cost. They forget what it takes to keep going when the place you've arrived at has already decided what to think of you. They forget the cold mornings and the quiet work and the years of being needed without being wanted, and the patience required to keep going anyway, and the way that patience stubborn, unglamorous, unrelenting patience is the actual thing that builds a life worth having. Maren Whitlock had not come to Red Hollow to be celebrated. She had come to be useful. But here is what she understood now. Standing in the firelight of the first spring supper with her husband's hand in hers and a town that had learned, one person at a time, to see her clearly. Being useful is where you start. It is not where you have to stop. The hands they had once looked at and found wanting broad and scarred and calloused from 20 years of hard work had planted a garden that fed people through winter, had set a bone that healed straight and true, had listened to a small boy's lungs and heard what others had missed, had signed a piece of paper that made something official that should have been official a long time ago, had held the hand of a woman who was scared and didn't know who else to reach for. Those hands were not evidence of what she lacked. They never had been. They were the record of what she knew. And Red Hollow, Wyoming, in the spring of 1888, had finally learned how to read it.